Good morning, everyone. I now declare open the public hearing of the Select Committee on Social Media and Online Safety via video and teleconference. In accordance with the committee's resolutions, this hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. Those present here today are advised that filming and recording are permitted during the hearing. I remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. And I now welcome representatives of the National Mental Health Commission to give evidence today, and ask that for the Hansard record for you to please state your full names and the capacities in which you appear before the committee.
Thank you, Chair. Christine Morgan, CEO of the National Mental Health Commission.
And Lyndall Soper, Deputy CEO of the National Mental Health Commission.
Thank you very much. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of both houses, of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'd like to thank you for your submission to the Select Committee on Social Media and Online Safety, which has been published, and we appreciate you taking the time to provide that to us. It is our usual practice to invite witnesses to make a short opening statement. If there's something further in addition to what's already been provided that you might like to contribute, and then we'll proceed to discussion and questions from the committee.
Thank you, Chair. Perhaps just by way of opening comments, and I think this is not anything different to what is in our submission, but to highlight a couple of key points that we will be looking at from the perspective very much of the mental health and well-being impacts of social media platform usage. And we look there in terms of social media, online platforms and gaming. We believe all are relevant. In the Commission at the moment, we are taking a particular focus on children and young people, but understand that the committee's reach, of course, is across all demographics of our society. In our opening comments, what we would like to highlight is that there are risks associated with usage of social media, online platforms and gaming. There is harmful content, there are hurtful interactions, there are negative comparisons which are made, which are particularly, I think, dangerous for our young people. There is unintended disclosure, there is loss of balance, and there is overuse. There are risks. Notwithstanding, of course, the many benefits that are made available through online platform social media usage, these are risks which we believe need to be identified and need to be addressed. What the research does show is that the impact of use of social media and online platforms is highly specific to an individual. So we would be calling for any measure which is being considered in order to assess and address risks is appropriately targeted, not just to a demographic group in a homogenous way, but is very much targeted to the particular usage that is being displayed. And to that sense, in that sense, there is a very clear intersect between those risks we have identified and individual behaviour patterns. So when we're looking at this from the intersect of such usage and impact on mental health and well-being, those behavioural patterns of people are very important and shouldn't be assumed, but should be investigated and targeted. The single biggest issue that has been raised by young people, the single biggest issue is not their ability to identify harmful content. Our young people in particular are pretty astute at being able to do that. They are challenged on how to effectively have it removed. And to that extent, I think they're talking there about a difference in agency between a young person being able to influence and that of their adults and associates. So one of the call-outs we believe from young people is further assistance or further measures that can ensure when there is harmful content that is there, that it is removed. And they are particularly concerned about content which is racist and discriminatory. So thank you, Chair. They would be our opening comments.
Thank you very much for those additional comments. They've actually been very helpful, actually, in expanding on some of the ideas that you outlined in your submission. So I'd like to thank you very much for your opening statement. My first question, I guess, just in response to what you've said just now, do you have any ideas about how this could be addressed or looked at by the committee, by the government, and by online platforms?
I think it is not a one-dimensional approach. I think it is an approach which looks at, and I will put this, it's not a caveat, I'll put this overarching statement. The overarching statement is that twofold. One, we all know the obvious, which is that social media, online platforms are now a mechanism we all use. They are here. We will be using them. In and of themselves, they are fairly agnostic. It's the way they are used, which is either to a negative or a positive. And to that end, there are many aspects of usage of social media and online platforms which are not only positive, but I think can actually be leveraged and further enhanced in order to ensure that we are moving towards a usage of social media that actually enhances mental health and well-being, not just ensures that it's not a negative impact. So I do think from a National Mental Health Commission perspective that it's a very important focus we would look at. When we're looking at the measures that could and should be used, I think it is a combination of what could and should be appropriately required from a safety perspective of the owners of our online platforms. And to this date, I think things such as algorithms, etc., have been preponderantly used in order to drive usage of those platforms, but they offer an opportunity to actually be used to prompt safe interventions. And that is certainly something. So in the space of what the owners of the online platform should be doing, that is definitely a place to go. There is a significant role for education in the sense of raising awareness of what is actually happening on social media and what resources are available in order to ensure that we have safe usage. And in particular, if you're looking at young people, we must look at the circles of influence on young people, and that will include obviously parents, carers, family members, and those others who influence young people. They need those education and resources. And thirdly, in particular, when we look at our young people, and we have heard this directly from young people we have engaged with over the last few months in some work we've been doing at the Commission, they very much want to be equipped with the capacity to ensure their own safety online. So looking at what it is that we are ensuring is available to our young people in terms of those skills is an area where I believe we need to refocus. And it is going to be important in that space to go back to the point that we raised in our early comments, that it is very much about individual behaviour. And we do need, therefore, to look at targeting not only our teenagers and our young adults, but also the impact on our children. We know that 97% of households where children are 15 years and over are exposed to online usage, but of course they have young people in the house as well. So I think it's a combination of requirements on the owners of the platforms themselves, the opportunities provided for all of us to be better educated as to the risks and to the benefits with appropriate resources, and a specific awareness of the need to be more highly nuanced and granulated in our approach to helping our young people be equipped as to how to stay safe online.
Thank you very much. I've got so many questions just from your comments, and I'll try to tease some of them out quickly so that I can give other members of the committee an opportunity. I was just really interested in your use of the word agnostic, actually, but I think you're just confirming that that was in relation to the platforms themselves being agnostic.
Correct. They are in and of
Yep.
themselves a conduit. I've been known before to make that comment in terms, if you like, of even media, etc. They are but a conduit. It's the content and the way that that conduit is being used that is either problematic or protective.
Yes, but when it goes to content, would you apply that same word of agnostic? Or I'm just interested because it was a comment that came up yesterday, and I would agree with you. I'll put it this way: I'd certainly agree that the platforms themselves are it's an agnostic. They're agnostic. I wanted to ask you, when you refer to young people, are you referring to children? In other words, those that would be ages that would be captured under the provisions for the Children's eSafety Commissioner, or are you referring to young people? In other words, can you just give us a broader outline of the age group that you're referring to?
Of course, when we talk about young people or children and young people, we look at from 0 through to 25 to 30, depending upon the work we're doing with the Commission, but recognising that there are demographics or sub-demographics within that broad range. So the way that we would engage for somebody who's 18 to 20 is probably different to how you would engage for 14, 15, and very different to how you would engage if they were 5 or 6.
Thank you. Thank you. What do you believe is working well in relation to ensuring or enhancing and ensuring online safety? And I guess I'd ask, I'm mindful that the Online Safety Act is coming into operation in the next few days, but not yet in operation. So I'll just sort of provide a qualifying statement there saying I acknowledge that we're almost talking a theoretical there because it hasn't yet actually happened, but it will. So what is working well, and what areas do you believe perhaps could be the subject of further consideration by this committee?
So when we're looking here at online safety, I think my answer to that one, Chair, and you may wish me to change my focus on this a little bit, where I naturally go on that is to say how our online platforms and social media usage are positive from a mental health and wellbeing perspective, particularly for our young people. Is that an appropriate place for me to go? It's a slight nuance on
that would be helpful. That would be very helpful.
Thank you. So look, I think that there are probably 7 areas where there are positive benefits that I strongly believe should be enhanced, and this should be taken into consideration when looking at issues of safety, because I think if we stop just at safety, we're stopping too soon. We need to actually be leveraging this and enhancing the capabilities to be positive. Without a shadow of a doubt, the social connectedness which is provided for people in that online space is incredibly important. And I'll make that very specific to COVID. You'll be aware that the Commission is on record that right from the beginning of the pandemic, we have been always emphasising the importance of not looking at social distancing, but physical distancing with social connection. And in fact, that need to reach in and connect with our fellow human beings has been demonstrated not only as being important for our mental health and wellbeing, but it's actually a strong protective factor against the more significant issues, including suicidality. So social connection is very important. One young person that we spoke to recently in some consultations talked about how being able to use the internet enabled them to find their tribe. They found those that they could connect with. And it's also particularly important when we look at the geography of Australia. We are a country which has vast areas that are remote, regional, and rural. And so that ability to have the social connectedness is important to our well-being as humans and has been very significantly highlighted during the pandemic. So that would be the first place I'd say. Certainly in terms of education and employment opportunities, and for young people in particular, the education opportunities are very significant. Again, we have seen through COVID as we've shifted the dial, if you like, very much to things such as online learning, etc. There are significant opportunities for those to further education, further employment prospects. That's particularly important for our young people. Intervention. Online access, social media use provides those of us who are concerned about the emotional, social or mental health and well-being of people to actually have positive opportunities to intervene and provide support. And that leads to the fourth, which is the actual provision of support and services. And there is a very significant and irreversible trend towards providing mental health services and supports, both across the spectrum of prevention, intervention, treatment, and sustainable recovery in the online space. E-mental health is an incredibly important focus, and we're looking there not just at applications or platforms, we're looking at what we call our e-mental health ecosystem, and that will involve very proactive usage of the online space, and that will require safety measures, but it is an irreversible trend that we need to not only recognise but embrace. It provides, as I've talked about, in addition to social connection, a place for people to find their own communities, their own ability for expression. For our young people, that's an incredibly important space to go. It's, let's face it, a place when things are negative, you can find things to enjoy online. It is a place for entertainment, it is a place for learning, it's a place to do things that are joyful. And the final one probably is a bookend to the first one I mentioned, which is social connection, is it minimises loneliness. And for this, I will go outside just children and young people. One of the emerging areas of concern, or perhaps it has emerged as an area of concern, I think I should say that in 2022, we're no longer in 2020 or 21, is the impact of loneliness on many people's lives. And we know that for those who are lonely, there is an increased risk of not only anxiety, but clinical depression. So it is incredibly important that we look at those benefits when we're considering safety and when we're looking at the benefits of social media usage and online usage.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions around some of the comments in relation to the importance of agency, particularly for young people, and I'm going to come back to those. I believe the Deputy Chair has some questions. Deputy Chair.
Thank you for that, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing here today. It's provided a useful bigger picture perspective about the role of social media amongst Australians' mental health more broadly. Before your appearance today, I was having a look at the National Children's Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy published last year by the Commission. That's the government's guiding framework for addressing mental health and wellbeing for young people. Is that right? Am I understanding this?
That's
the role of that? Thank you. So it was kind of striking to me reading that social media doesn't really appear to rate a mention in that strategy. Well, sorry, it's mentioned twice, but both times in the context of potential benefits for parents. This is like a useful perspective for the committee to hear, because obviously we hear the downside and the harms and the risks pretty regularly from witnesses. You've been talking about the social connection role of social media in the upside. Should we read anything into the fact that these downside risks weren't addressed explicitly in this strategy, or does it just go to that point you were making earlier about this being a particularly individualised effect on people's mental health when people in a particular situation with social media are vulnerable to this?
I'll give an answer which is a little bit between the two of those. So first, please don't read into the fact that it's not specifically referenced in its own domain as being that it's not regarded as being important. And it is not just a case of individual behaviour, though that I think is the landing point for any initiatives and targeted use. It is rather that when we were looking at doing the children's strategy, we needed to look at what are those domain settings which are particularly influential for young people, And in that, of course, we looked at family and communities, we looked at education settings, and we looked at our service system settings because we were looking at it from a mental health and wellbeing. That is our health system. And then we bookended it or wrapped it around with evidence and evaluation. Social media was not specifically made a domain or area, not because it's not important, but because it is a mechanism across all of them. So social media usage is effectively a means by which we engage, whichever of those domains we may be in. So if we are in family and community, then in fact there is a plethora of touch points where you would be looking at the intersect between social media and young people, children and young people in that space. And that would include, of course, how for children in a family community space, families were engaging with the use of media. So it is, and then if you moved across to your education settings, then of course there is what is happening in that space in terms of social media. So it was more, Deputy Chair, that it is a means that of our communication, our usage, our way of being and doing things in 2022, which is tied to all of those. So that is why it's not really looked at as being a specific standalone siloed thing, rather it's a mechanism.
It goes to the point you were making earlier about the need to take a holistic approach in this space. So there's not going to be any sort of regulatory silver bullet that we can, fire or recommend from this committee that's going to address this issue as a standalone, is there?
Look, I think it is. I've been heard to say previously that I think that what has happened in the technological digitalisation online space for us now in the 21st century is probably akin to what happened in the Industrial Revolution centuries ago, that it effectively is changing anything and everything that we do, including our societal hierarchical structure, how we interact with each other, how we find employment, in fact, every aspect of our life. So it's not as though it sits in a silo and we manage it in a silo. It is a mechanism that is impacting on absolutely everything we do, which is probably why, from a commission perspective with mental health and wellbeing, we see it as having so many different touch points. It's not how you manage each touch point, it's how the whole thing is being leveraged more towards the positive with protection against the negative.
Yeah. So exploring the potential benefits of social media in that kind of touching across the full gamut perspective there. One of the things you mentioned earlier was the potential for social connection, and that's not just a way that we find social connection during a time of crisis like COVID, when we're all locked down in our homes. We can still stay in touch with people via social media, and that's important. But also, I was interested in your comments about the role of social media in helping people to find their tribe, to find their place in the world, so to speak. Some witnesses in submissions to this inquiry have suggested that an important part, particularly for young people, of this finding a tribe process comes from people exploring social media pseudonymously. So not using their real name, but, for example, if they are trying to find themselves exploring their own sexuality, dealing with issues of mental health that they might feel shame about or uncertain, talking to families or communities about, that an online space can be a safe space for them to find people with similar experiences and similar issues that they're confronting. Have you done much research, or are aware of much research about the importance of this kind of pseudonymous or exploration of this social connection without using real names?
In terms of research, I think I need to make a general comment there that the research that has been done around social media usage, etc., I think is being done. There is far too little of it, and it's far too general. So I think I'm not aware of specific research around pseudo-anonymity. I can make a general comment, and that is that, as we all know, the anonymity that sits within social media usage really sits there and can be of benefit, or it can be a negative. So I think it is a fact. I think it is a fact that goes with social media usage. There is the capacity to be anonymous, so there will be those who will be attracted to using it for those purposes. Again, it can be a positive, and it can be a negative. And I think this is where upskilling young people to have agency about how to do things safely is incredibly important. We know, in fact, that issue of anonymity, even if we take it outside young people, one of the benefits that many people cite for using Lifeline as a place to go is anonymity. That doesn't negate the need when you are actually maybe engaging with mental health services. You need to have moved from a position of anonymity to a place where you are able to connect within the construct of yourself. But for many, many people, it is a critical entry point. My own view from a mental health commission perspective or a mental health perspective is that if anonymity provides an entry point which ultimately ends in a better place for somebody, then that is in and of itself a good thing. But again, it's about what are the protections to ensure it is safe, and when it comes to online usage, one of the most significant protective factors is self-agency in being able to do it and recognise when you're not safe and knowing where you can go or how you can disengage.
Okay, thank you. That's very useful. It's not we're not dealing in absolutes here. It's highly contextual, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Okay. Chair, did you want to step in with your questions?
Thank you. And that was actually a really useful conversation. Just to, I guess, use the recent discussion we've just had, I want to come back to this concept of agency, which I just think is very powerful, and what you said about a highly individualised response, I guess, or approach. I noted just a couple of things. I noted in your submission when I read it, I underlined what you actually said about this. In consultation with young people, increased accountability for social media service providers regarding harmful material and conduct was raised as a desired outcome. Young people noted that they often struggle to report harmful content and have it successfully removed on platforms such as TikTok, Instagram and Facebook. I'm wondering firstly whether you have some background research or information or data or a survey or anything that may help inform the committee that you would be able to share further details around that, if that is possible.
Look, certainly what we can undertake to do is to provide what we may have, which is appropriate. Within this construct, the Commission has now for the last few months been undertaking a piece of work in consultation with a technical advisory group of multidisciplinary experts from multiple disciplines, is a better way to put that, of those who work with or influence young people, but also with a group of young advocates themselves. And what we have been actively exploring is what are the drivers and in fact the amplifiers that we have identified that sit behind a trajectory which is not a positive one for our young people. The trajectory is that the mental health and wellbeing of our young people has been declining steadily for the last few years. It began prior to COVID and has been accelerated or exacerbated or both by COVID. We are at a position of curiosity in the Commission at the moment, where we are doing a much deeper dive into trying to understand what is actually happening and what is causing that. And in that space, I've had a number of conversations with both our young advocates and our technical advisory group around the issue of social media usage, online usage, and looking at whether that is in and of itself a driver towards mental health and wellbeing in a negative or positive. And where we have landed with that is to say it's probably an amplifier, not a driver in and of itself. But in that construct, coming back to your question of what evidence we may have about those comments from young people, there are a number of sources we can go back and just check for you. There's certainly the Mission Australia survey looked at social media usage, and that would be included, and we would have our own conversations that we've had. So perhaps, Chair, we could take that on notice and look to see what we could provide by way of further evidence to the committee.
I'd be really, really happy with that and appreciate your response in due course. So thank you. That would be really helpful. I'm going to try and I'm still formulating my thought processes around this, particularly in reference to some of your earlier conversations of comments around agency, particularly for young people. I am wondering whether young people themselves and whether you have any observations or suggestions in your research from young people about how they might be able to better have agency, or they might be able, how they would like to see this issue addressed in terms of making it easy or easier to, or easy to have harmful content removed or at least addressed. Is there anything that you've heard from young people about what they're saying are the challenges and what they're saying should be some of the changes?
Look, I will ask my colleague to comment on this if there's anything specifically that's come through, but some general observations on that. The comments about young people finding it difficult to get things removed was also echoed in comments that they made about issues such as, and it's not for this committee, but issues that are other issues of concern to them, like climate change, etc. It was a comment about the fact that, per se, by being a young person, I have a less ability to influence my environment and decisions that are being made that impact on me than perhaps I would if I was older. So I think it's a factor of being young. It's a factor of, I can raise these concerns, but to what extent are they going to be picked up and influenced? So I think what young people, that was my first observation. The second observation from sitting in those conversations with young people is they very appropriately are able to say, we don't think that we're actually being provided with as much help as perhaps we could or should be to help us stay safe. But of course, they don't know what they don't know. So they are able to identify what it is. But I think, and this is particularly the case, Chair, if you're looking at impacts on children. Children and young people very eloquently can tell us if they don't feel safe or if they feel as though something's wrong. But I fear that at times we go to them for the answers, when in fact the answer they're wanting is, please, can you provide it with us? We do it in education settings at schools. We work out what it is we think that we really need to be doing. I think that the onus very much shifts to those who have a broader view, not just of what is happening in social media usage and online usage, but also, and this is why we're working with a technical advisory group, of those who really do understand from a professional discipline perspective what will, in a positive way, influence behavioural patterns of young people. So this isn't just about how are we managing content online or how are we providing them with the equivalent of the old-fashioned media literacy. I think we need to go much deeper than that. We need to be saying, how are our young people, what are the patterns of behaviour that they're exhibiting? Are they any different to how they've been before? What is the consequences in terms of their behaviours to being in an online environment which has two attributes to it that may not have been there in generations past? One is a plethora of information in real time and much deeper, broader than information that was available before. And secondly, an urgency and an immediacy about decision making that has not been there in past generations. So they're the types of issues that I think we need to look at through a professional discipline lens and say, what could or should we be doing in that space? Now, that's where I think we need to go in terms of research, in terms of inquiry, and in terms of considerations, alongside, of course, what is actually happening in terms of content and regulation and other things that are happening in that space.
If I could just add to that, come from a slightly different angle. We haven't got anything definitive yet, as Christine has said, but some of our early thinking around this, I'd just like to unpack some of that for you. So if we think about social media and online as having three kind of levels to it. So social media platforms, so Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Chat platforms like WhatsApp, Snapchat, and then gaming, online gaming platforms, they handle this to different degrees. So the social media platforms do provide ability for you to take down content that is causing concern, But for young people, it's a hard slog. It's hard to do. They need to make that easier for that particular demographic to be able to report and get on like that content removed. Much harder in the chat platforms and much harder in the online gaming platform world. So I think there needs to be some further exploration of how the owners of those particular platforms can work with young people to help them remove problematic content. Sorry, when it's there. I think the other thing that Christine had talked about earlier was around utilising algorithms which can provide prompts for resources when words associated with poor mental health or potential self-harm pops up. Once again, the social media platforms are better at doing that. The chat platforms and the gaming platforms are nowhere near as sophisticated. They need to bring that up to a standard similar to the social media platforms.
Thank you. It was interesting. I appreciate your thoughtful contributions, and thank you. I know it's not an easy area to sort of wend our way through. I note some of the observations about algorithms and about platforms, and I guess my question is going to come by way of sharing two experiences. And I'll admit, I don't know if this is a declaration or something like that, but I'll admit, personal experiences do inform approach and understanding with any individual. My first experience was over 20 years ago when, as a young person, I was subject to some of the most horrific online and in-person abuse. It was cyberbullying as well as direct bullying. And the impact on me was so significant that it lasted probably 20 years. I think I'm just cleaning up the tail end of it now. But it was profound. It caused a change of career. It caused a questioning of my identity, the sense of the shame and the degradation, the sense of everything that I had to go through that you would understand. I was a young person back then based on your definition, but I had no agency. I had no recourse to ask that this horrific material be taken down. It stayed there for years until, the page just disappeared, and you can't find it these days, which is great. So I probably have an insight and an appreciation into why having that agency to have material that causes such direct and long-term harm is so important and powerful, I think. But if I park that experience for a moment and then I go to some of the evidence that we took yesterday, or I look at some of my own experiences, as a public figure, and some of the comments that you get in relation to that, or I look at some of the comments by other well-known individuals where they were trying to get them taken down by the platforms, and they found that difficult. Arguably, you would think that public figures with greater access to the ability to be able to reach into areas of influence, you would think their sense of, I don't know if you call this agency, but you'd think that their ability to be able to deal with it and address it would be much greater. And yet it seems as though the bar is incredibly high there as well. It seems for me, my observation by sharing those two things is just to put to you a proposition to say, it seems as though there's a lot of work to do when it comes to platforms being able to be easily accessible, particularly by young people, in terms of being able to quickly address some of this content and have it removed, instead of being so hard with so many hoops and jumps to have to try to get over. Because in my personal experience, every one of those big hoops actually decreases your sense of agency and increases a sense of despair and that this is too hard. Would a simple, effective, direct intervention and communication with, or some form of mechanism to be able to do that with all of the online platforms, go some way towards helping that with young people? And should it be around, I don't know, by means of a code of conduct or something mandatory, or just, you may not have observations about the direct mechanism, but just, I guess, I'm asking comments in relation to directly the role, responsibility and comment on the platforms themselves in keeping their users safe. I hope that makes sense.
It makes a whole heap of sense, and I totally agree. I think, in fact, I would go so far as to say we absolutely need to be putting the onus onto the online platforms. There is a very highly protected concept in the world of mental health, and it extends into other areas, which is a concept of do no harm. A concept of do no harm does not exist at the moment in terms of our online platforms. There is a concept of, oh, if that is harmful, I should consider perhaps taking it down. We do need to very significantly shift. So I guess I'm answering you, Chair, in a way which is not so much about should there be a mechanism to do it. I think we actually need a fundamental shift in approach with our online platforms and recognising the harm that can be caused and effectively moving, and this is aspirational, I acknowledge it, but moving into their very DNA an approach which says there is potential harm that can be caused through what I am offering. What are the mechanisms that are in place to ensure that that is minimised? Because, of course, you have the challenge when it comes to content that what is harmful for one person may not be harmful for another. And that, I think, is a shield behind which many can hide. So we need to address the complexities of that as well. And this is why I don't think it's a simple one-dimensional answer. It is a cultural shift, it is an approach shift, but it is also a shift where, because harm is being caused, you actually need some immediacy as well, so that you actually minimise harm. I would have a zero tolerance when it comes to content which is driving people towards self-harm, suicidality, suicidal risk, suicidal behaviour. Zero tolerance. You must be able to move quickly, but I think you need an underpinning cultural shift as well.
Well, it's interesting you say that, and you may have noted I sort of flagged something earlier when I picked up that word you said, agnostic. I picked it up because it was used with one of the other platforms in relation to, and I don't want to misquote them because I don't have the transcript yet, but it, from my memory to the best recollection I have, it was around content and linking to this word, which I took umbrage with at the time, because the platform, the mechanism itself is absolutely agnostic. And then there was a long conversation around context. And I guess, again, with reference to personal experience, context only goes so far in terms of justifying or defending what is abusive and harmful, derogatory, demeaning and degrading. And I'm not sure it goes very far at all, but, trying to pick up your point about, highly individualised and being aware of context and communication, etc. But it is interesting because this is the first time we've had almost a balance, but, if you're looking at a weighing, something weighing up, the balance to the concept of context is the context itself should be do no harm. And that's not a conversation we've had yet, but it's a really interesting one that perhaps we should pick up about balancing some of these challenges between context and the maybe overriding priority of doing no harm. Just a comment in relation to that, and then I'll hand to the Deputy Chair.
So I think in terms of is content agnostic? No, I don't believe it is. I think content is open to interpretation, but I unashamedly come to a space where there is certain content which is harmful, full stop. And it is harmful per se, and then put it into a context of the age of the person who might be exposed to that content, and it is harmful per se. So I think there are those spaces, but I do recognise that we're probably looking at a spectrum of content. And so whilst there is that for which it can be said that is harmful and is particularly harmful for children and should be removed, there is, if you move up the spectrum or across the spectrum, you might become to a place where context is more relevant or more influential on the impact of that content. And I think that intersect between the content and the context, it's the interplay of that when you bring in the individual. And I go back to the point that the research is showing, which is that there is, it is highly specific. When you're looking at issues of harm, it is highly specific to the individual and their usage. And so it's very highly specific. Of course, we all have vulnerabilities, we all have strengths, we all have different antennas. So I think it is very complex in that way. So that would be my point. And as I said, that's why I would, if I was looking at a cultural shift here, I would move very strongly to a do no harm space and then look at what is it that we need to do to shift towards there.
Thank you, Ms Morgan. I believe Ms Hammond has a question and then the Deputy Chair, and thank you, Deputy Chair.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ms Morgan. What you've just set out there, I think is a really good point for our committee to take on board. And if I can just make sure I've got it correct, we should take a do no harm approach to social media and online activities. But you also mentioned we need to do more research so that we can get a full understanding. So it's essentially putting in place some mechanisms to limit the damage or to ensure there is no harm or minimise harm while we undertake more research to fully get across and understand all of the implications and things that are happening because of online. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I'd probably sharpen the point about the research. I've got particular interest in being able to understand the understanding behaviours within the context of social media usage, and
Yes.
that might be driving it. So I think I think there's been a lot of focus in social media usage around content and around amount of usage and those kind of issues. I think being able to nuance it, particularly in the mental health and wellbeing space, to behavioural patterns and what we can do in order to manage behavioural patterns, I hypothesise could be a useful place to go when we're looking at how we can improve agency and safety for everyone in terms of online and social media usage.
Thank you, Ms Morgan. If I could then put on notice, if you could make suggestions at a later time, perhaps on the types of research and in what fields would be best undertaken to the committee, because, you know, obviously it's mental health, it's medical, but there'd be a range of disciplines involved. So if you could take on board that and perhaps if you could send through some recommendations as the sort of research we should be recommending, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
And perhaps if I could just ask to ensure that I'm on track whether Linda, was there any comment you wanted to make around that?
No, sorry,
Yeah, please. Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms Hammond. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Just following on from this agency point, I think the point that you made, that I think you described it as often young people don't know what they don't know, is an important one here. You're sort of talking that this goes beyond sort of traditional media literacy. It's not just understanding the mechanics of how these platforms work, and that they're not just a neutral forum that that they're trying to make money out of it, and understanding the way that operation works. It goes beyond that to something more like citizenship, and that encompasses your own agency on these platforms, what you can do to shape your experience of them, to shape the experience of the platform more broadly. In that context, are you aware of any sort of government-funded programs that deal with equipping young people with these tools that they need to effectively exercise their agency in this context, appreciating that it does go beyond sort of just classic media literacy? Are we doing enough here?
Look, I think it's, if I could answer that in two ways. Firstly, what am I aware of? My ability to answer that question in the here and now is somewhat limited, but
please take it on notice if that's helpful.
But certainly, for instance, if I put on my hat in the suicide prevention space, then the work that is being done by Origin around ChatSafe is incredibly important, because it's actually taking that on board and saying, how are we doing this in a safe way? So there is some exemplary work that is being done. I'm sure there are certainly services and supports that are currently being provided, although I can't detail them all here. It is an area where I think there is an increased focus coming through of what could and should we be doing in order to enhance the ability of our young people to know how to do it safely. And I think if I can take it back to the point that you made about pseudo-anonymity, our young people will be participating online, social media usage, online usage, not always in a way which is explicit and which parents and others can actually have a line of sight to. We know that. We know that. So to the extent that that shadow usage, if you want to call it, does exist, that's where it's imperative. I don't think it's an option. We must be looking at how are we actually equipping our young person so that at that moment in time when they don't have the scaffolding of parents or others around them, we're better equipped them to be able to do it.
Would you mind if I add something to that? In terms of your question around do we know what else is happening within a Commonwealth government environment? If you are hearing evidence from the Commonwealth Department of Health, they probably have a much better understanding of what programs have been put in place, and they will have access to that information for you better than we could.
Okay, but there's not like in your position as experts in this youth mental health space, there's not an obvious program that's providing systemic, holistic investments in the capabilities and agencies of young people in this space.
I think it is more that I would be loath to try and pick out one. I think it's
Sure.
a number of them. So there's not an absence of work being done. There's a lot of work that's being done. In particular, if you looked at Commonwealth-funded organisations such as Reach Out, they're doing an incredible amount of work with young people. eHeadspace is doing a lot of work with young people. So there is much work that is being done, many programs that are being developed. So my hesitancy is not because there is an absence of it, but rather there is a lot of work, and I think it would be disproportionate to pick out one over others.
Okay, understood. So just one more question about agency. When I think about building tools and mechanisms for young people to address with the content, the harmful content, getting things taken down, as you say, is it appropriate to think that we need to design these tools in a way that is age appropriate, that gives young people a experience of engaging with those tools and institutions that isn't also harmful in themselves? I mean, do we need to be making it as easy as possible for young people in particular to address this, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
We need to make it as easy as possible for young people, and B, we need to recognise that they need reinforced support from adults at any time that they reach out. I strongly believe that if a young person is reaching out to either disengage or to deal with an issue with content or anything else where they're feeling unsafe, they should have easy, clear mechanisms to do so, and they should be provided with nets of support and other forms of support to ensure that they not only are able to do it, but they are reinforced. And I go back to perhaps what was shared by the chair there, that the negative impacts of a lot of this are very real. And so for a young person who's reaching out because they need to disengage, because they feel they might be exposed to something harmful, we stop too soon if we just ensure they disengage. You need to reach in to say, has there already been an impact? And if so, what do we need to do about that?
So really they need advocacy and support in going through that process, don't they?
Absolutely. And recognition of consequences, even if they, as soon as you see something which is harmful, if you register, that's not good for me, your brain's already registered it. Now you need to get it down quickly, but to the extent you have been exposed to it, best practice would say do something to check there hasn't been a negative consequence from that.
Can I just ask one more question on this, Chair?
Yeah.
So, and so in my mind, I'm attracted by the E-Safety Commissioner, which used to be the Children's E-Safety Commissioner, obviously, because, it is that kind of design of, understanding that, they need that advocacy and that support, and it's a tailored solution for young people there. As a contrast to that, though, you could see how it could be potentially damaging to encourage young people to go through an adversarial process to try and seek addressing its harm. So for example, initiating legal proceedings would even be re-traumatising, couldn't it?
Most definitely that would be the case. It needs to be easy. It needs to be as accessible and as easy to do as the content was that is harmful to them.
So something that is costly and adversarial is not going to achieve that. Okay, thank you.
Deputy Chair, thank you. And to our witnesses, thank you. I'm supposed to be wrapping up, but I just have a question based on what you've said. If you don't mind, that I feel might be relevant. It's just really interesting when you referred before to the Deputy Chair, in response to the Deputy Chair's questions, and I may have written it down wrongly, but it jumped out. You were talking about impact, that we needed to consider the impact on an individual. And it made me go inside. I went, but even in reaching out, even the act of reaching out to a platform, whether it be TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, to say this has caused me harm, that in itself would ordinarily demonstrate at least a, due consideration that has caused impact. I know there can always be false claims, etc., and I'm not sort of denying that due process has to take place, but we don't even necessarily have that consideration at the moment in place, do we?
Agreed, we don't, and I think we should. So I think we should. I think when something registers in our brains or subconsciously that has hurt me, that is negative, then there has been an impact. We need to do that. And I would also question if reaching out to the platform where the content is that has caused me harm is the right place to go. Is there anything else we can consider so that a young person doesn't necessarily have to reach out to the very platform where that discomfort, if nothing else has happened, whether there is another mechanism for them. So it needs to be easy, accessible and effective in terms of getting that content out of their reach.
It was just an interesting conversation yesterday. A different line of inquiry was looking at disinformation, misinformation, and I noted the platforms made use of the word moderation a lot, and one in particular indicated a conversation around, well, maybe sometimes we can over-moderate, but that's obviously out of the abundance of caution, is the point I took. Fair point, valid point. My question is, why aren't we applying it? Moderation and even the concept of abundance of caution, if necessary, sometimes should we be making more allowances to keep kids, young people safe online by leaning sometimes on, well, for the avoidance of doubt, we do this, and then there's steps. Just a question.
And probably answered with, if not another question, then another nuanced response, which is we want the very, very best for our young people. We want their brains to be exposed and then for them to explore concepts which are uncomfortable but not harmful. So finding a solution to this, I don't think is going to be a definitive black and white. There might be some polarisation where it is black and white. I think that overarching of word I used in my opening comments was, notwithstanding the benefits, we must address the risks. But that very word, notwithstanding, is an acknowledgement there are very real positives to online and social media use, and it enables in some ways the potential of our young people to be leveraged much more effectively and further and deeper than past generations. So finding a way to be able to balance that, I think, is the very wicked question that we must be addressing.
Thank you very, very much. I'm conscious we have gone over time. I thank you for your forbearance and willingness to continue to be available to this committee. We very much appreciate that and your considered responses today. I would like to thank you for coming along today and indicate that for any information that you've been asked to provide or for further questions on notice, would you please forward this through to the Secretary by the 4th of February 2022? And also just to let you know that you'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and you'll have the opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors Thank you again for your attendance. I'm going to suspend the committee for maybe a minute or two just to ensure that we have our witnesses for the next session, and then we'll resume again.
Thank you. You.
I now resume the public hearing of the Select Committee on Social Media and Online Safety via video and teleconference, and welcome witnesses of Twitter to give evidence today. I ask that for the Hansard record, you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, my name is Kara Hinesley. I'm the Director of Public Policy for Australia and New Zealand here at Twitter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Kathleen Reen, and I'm the Senior Director for Public Policy and Philanthropy for Asia Pacific at Twitter, and I'm dialing in from Singapore.
Thank you very much to the two of you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as the proceeding of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I would like to thank you for the submission that you provided to the committee and which has been published. It is a very comprehensive submission, and unless you have if you have an opening statement that provides additional information on top of that submission, you are welcome, or we would be very happy to proceed to discussion and questions from the committee, as I know there are many.
Thank you, Chair. We're happy to proceed to questions.
Thank you very much. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I've got some broader questions, but there is just one specific issue that I want to just delve into before broaden things out and get your response to. I'm sure you saw late last year, in fact, I think it was 31st of December last year, a New York Times article detailing how the Chinese Communist Party monitors Twitter to identify and then intimidate and harass critics offshore, particularly those with relatives still in China, pressuring them to remove criticism on platforms like Twitter. This story cites a Chinese police manual that, quote, specifically called for monitoring activity on foreign websites and reports. They're then intimidated by Chinese authorities from China, often using their families. The article states that, quote, actions against people for speaking out on Twitter and Facebook have increased in China since 2019, according to an online database aggregating them. Are you aware of this practice? And is there anything you're doing in response to it?
Thank you for the question, Deputy Chair. Given the remit, I will hand this over to our Senior Director, Kathleen Reen, for the region.
Thank you, Deputy Chair, for the question. We are aware that there are attempts by a range of governments, including the government of China, to ensure that their narratives and perspectives are those that are most dominant. Twitter is clear-eyed about the goals of Chinese officials' use of our service, and we know that the government uses Twitter to further their own political narratives and that they innovate to achieve those goals where they can. We do and continue to seek to support human rights activists and their expression on our platform. And it's for that reason we iterate our own efforts to ensure that there's an even playing field wherever we can for everyone on the service. The impacts of what we can do on Twitter are limited given the entire information ecosystem that you just mentioned. But I would draw your attention to the work that we do to try and protect the service when it comes to these types of issues. We also have a major project called Sunlight, a very strong ongoing partnership with organisations such as ASPI, which is focused on China heavily, using Twitter data and studying the issues since 2020. For example, as part of our data disclosure work, in June 2020, we shared relevant data with the research partner, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who published a ground-setting report called Retweeting Through the Firewall, utilising Twitter's open API and data sets. It's an example of the types of partnerships we undertake to understand what actors are trying to do with our service and what we can do to combat, understand or address domestic or foreign-led efforts to try and manipulate our service, which is a violation of our policies.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I congratulate Twitter on the labelling of state-based media on your platform. I think that has had a useful effect on the ecosystem, and I know that you're a leader in that respect. But there was one specific story in this New York Times article that did concern me, that I'm keen to get your response to. The article described one account of a 23-year-old Chinese student in Australia who received a video call from police using her father's phone. And these police then pushed her to remove her Twitter account. This was dealing with a parody account, not in their own name, that she created. The article described the situation like this, quote, "This time, calling her via video chat, they told her to report to the station when she returned to China and asked her how much longer her Australian visa was valid. Fearful, she denied owning a Twitter account, but filmed the call and kept the account up. A few months later, Twitter suspended it. After an inquiry from the New York Times, Twitter restored this account, and a Twitter spokesman said that it had been taken down in error. Can you explain what happened here? What was the error there, and what led to that account being taken down?
Apologies, Deputy Chair. I would need to go back and come back to you on notice with the details of that very particular case, but we'd be happy to bring information forward about what occurred and why it was suspended and why it was reinstated. I don't have all the details on that particular case at hand.
Okay, but you don't respond to requests to take down sites from the CCP?
To be very clear, no, we do not. We take action on accounts when they violate the Twitter rules or our terms of service, and our view and perspective is that those apply equally to everyone. We do not succumb to pressure to take down accounts that are not in violation of those. And in fact, our Twitter transparency report, which is produced approximately twice every year since 2012, shows very clearly for the record how Twitter responds to government requests. And I think you will see that the numbers when it comes to those sorts of information requests and takedowns are extremely low to non-existent.
Yeah, I wouldn't imagine that this would have been in response to a direct request, but are you concerned that there's potential for more, let's call it foreign interference, manipulating your moderation and trust and safety policies? It does seem a disturbing coincidence that this account was attracting this kind of attention from these authorities and was then taken down in this way.
Again, Deputy Chair, I would need to dig in and go back to our internal teams in order to get the exact details of that particular case, of a particular situation that you said occurred at the end of last year. I apologise. There are a lot of tweets on Twitter, 1 billion or so within every 2 days, and I know there are increasingly a lot of stories about individual tweets as well. So I'll have to come back to you on it. But let me be very clear. We have a zero tolerance policy for manipulation, including spammy behaviour or other attempts to distort or distress the conversations on Twitter. We've expanded our policies and our team significantly over the last 2 years to address attempts by state-based actors as well. And we've expanded our abilities to address, to predict and to respond to those challenges. And again, in our Twitter transparency report, we have clear and large sections writing up and reporting out publicly our progress in those areas, as bad actors also seek to iterate their efforts to try and change or manipulate the conversation. One of the reasons why we have labelled state-affiliated accounts and state-affiliated media accounts is to help bring understanding and nuance. Those annotations help people using Twitter understand who and what they're looking at and who they're engaging with. But that is in addition to the daily work of our investigation teams and our research teams who are trying to protect the conversation on the platform.
Yeah, I'm certainly not insinuating any ill intent here. And in fact, I want to take this opportunity to recognise the leadership that Twitter's played in the policy debate in this space. I think that the document you released, I think it was towards the end of last year, this Protecting the Open Internet Principles for Policymakers document, I thought was a really good, high quality piece of work, and I appreciated the outreach around that. But you'll understand why I found this particular story quite disturbing, and I really would appreciate you looking into that in some detail. I mean, look, I have friends who have been subjected to this kind of, to group-based harassment on Twitter on the basis of, human rights advocacy or foreign policy opinions. Maybe the individual tweets wouldn't qualify. Well, in fact, lots of the individual tweets would contravene the abuse rules, but in the sheer volume of them, they are incredibly intimidating. What are you dealing with? What are you doing to sort of combat this kind of group-based attacks and harassment and abuse on your platform? So not individual tweets, but large numbers of people, in a seemingly coordinated way, not bots, like real people that seem to be coordinated by some entities harassing people.
Thank you, Deputy Chair, for the question. I'm happy to take this in the first instance, and then if anything that Kathleen would like to add at the end, please feel free. With regards to the way that we're looking at abuse and harassment at scale, which you've referenced, we are looking very closely at pretty much two things: the design of how Twitter is encouraging healthy conversations. So how are we actually incentivizing any type of issues that might be taking advantage of our product or policies and trying to circumvent those. And then, of course, looking at ways that we can use technology to reduce the burden on victims of abuse. So under looking at kind of like the design of Twitter, we've really strengthened our policies around the platform manipulation that Kathleen had spoken to previously, where we have not only added new teams, but we have also gotten a lot better at using machine learning to identify when we're seeing some sort of swarm or all of a sudden an uptick in attention or abuse, especially targeted at specific or in an individual account. And being able to then have that surfaced up and flagged to our Twitter service, our content moderation team that's able to look at this against our policies and then be able to take coordinated action across the accounts that are participating in that behavior, instead of trying to do it at that one-off back and forth. And we've seen actually really strong moves towards being able to take this down at scale. And we've seen this actually result in fewer abuse reports having to be submitted to our teams to be able to see that this kind of attention needs to be given again to a specific case or a specific groups of accounts. So that's where we've been really trying to focus a lot of our technology and also the way that we're designing the platform to be able to look at that kind of, I think, scaled behavior is what you were speaking to.
Yeah, my impression is that this has improved over time. The particularly egregious incidents that I can think of were a few years ago now. But the ultimate result of those incidents is that those people are no longer on your platform. So it's somewhat difficult to judge whether those have been effective. But I really would encourage you to keep working on that, particularly in this context of foreign interference. I might just, if I'm able to ask one more question on a different topic, Chair, and then I'll hand back. We can move on to other members. So in your submission talks about the fact that you've overhauled your policy around hate speech and adopted a broader definition of abuse directed to members of groups beyond race. And your submission contrasts this with the current definition of hate speech in Australian law, which you say is too narrow. Your submission says, quote, "Conversely, Australia continues to utilise a very limited definition of hate speech under the Racial Discrimination Act that is limited to race-based speech or behaviour and does not include a number of aforementioned categories, including sexual orientation, disability-based, religious-based or gender-based speech. We've heard from a number of other witnesses in this inquiry that support expanding the definition of online harms in the Online Safety Act to include abuse directed at group characteristics rather than individuals particularly. So is that something that you would endorse? Are you aware of approaches to this group-based abuse problem in other jurisdictions that Australia should be learning from and following?
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Yes, this is something that we've actually taken a lot of time and consideration, especially in Australia, as we've undertaken new ways at looking at our policy development. So a few years ago, we started to routinely open up new updates to our policies through public consultation, essentially. So we open it up through a various number of ways. Previously, we had worked very closely with our Trust and Safety Council members, which was a group of experts and academics and safety groups around the world that would help us consult and give feedback on policy and product updates. We opened this up to public consultation. And that recommendation that you've read through from our submission actually came about during our dehumanization updates to our hateful conduct policy. So we had a multi-staged approach at updating our hateful conduct policy that stepped through a number of different marginalized communities, vulnerable communities, and areas where we were seeing that the contours of the online conversation had changed and were actually starting to not meet up with community expectations on where there was the ability for people to control their own experience or to be able to report and have content taken down off of Twitter. During these dehumanization consultations, we actually worked with a number of organizations here in Australia, and some of which you've heard from, some of which I think you're hearing from next week. And we received a lot of feedback that while there was hateful conduct being directed to certain individuals, it was the group conversations, it was the chronic abuse that vulnerable communities were suffering that was most harmful to them. And this was actually directly inputted into the update that we had around racism and national origin and ethnicity updates to our dehumanization policy. So we think that there would be room for this committee and as well as the federal government to consider how the federal law is defining that, and having clear definitions from the government helps us have more certainty in how we can follow local law and adjudicate rules in conjunction with local context. So that's where that's come from. And I'm happy to send through more information about that consultation, but this was direct feedback that we'd received not only from Australian partners, but more globally.
No, please, I'd be interested in more detail about that process. It does sound like a substantive one. But the upshot here really is that your policies as a platform have moved in advance of Australian law in this context, haven't they?
We're trying to keep pace with what people are telling us they want to see on the platform. So again, Australia has been moving forward in a lot of different areas, and we've worked very closely with a number of regulators and policymakers like yourself on that. But this is an area where I think that there could be additional work.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Chair, I'm happy to pass the mic at this moment. I do have plenty of other questions though, so happy to come back.
Thank you very much. I was going to go to Ms. Hammond. Ms. Hammond, and I actually want to pick up the conversation directly from where we are now. Ms. Hammond, would you like to go now, or do you want me to ask a couple of questions? Are you sure? Okay. All right. Well, thank you. That's very gracious. Thank you very much. I want to pick up actually from where you left off, because as somebody who has experienced abuse and cyberbullying for a period of many years, that it was both in an individual capacity and as a public figure, I'm really well aware of the word dehumanisation and how abuse dehumanises an individual and, I guess, a community group or a community. So I just firstly want to endorse the fact that Twitter is considering the dehumanising impact of abuse and harmful content, because that's incredibly important. But I look and I look at some of what's in your submission, and I thank you for it. And on the one hand, I think this is wonderful that you have got a hateful content policy. But then I look at some of the tweets that are directed at me that don't get taken down, or I look at some of the other tweets that I'm going to read out to you that I know have been the subject of very public conversation. And I guess I wonder how hateful content and your hateful content policy is actually policed and managed and moderated, given that so much harmful content seems to remain on Twitter and stay on Twitter directed at individuals. So just a comment on that firstly.
Thank you, Chair, for letting us comment on this. I will give a short answer, and then if there's anything that Kathleen would like to add, she can jump in. But initially, I would just want to apologize for any harm that might have come across on Twitter that might still be there. I know that it can be horrific, and having worked with a lot of victims of abuse or victim survivors in my time here at Twitter, it's something that we care very deeply about. And I understand that this is something that is a lived experience for you. And so I appreciate you sharing this information with us and helping us think through where we need to continue to make strides. In terms of abuse, I'm so sorry, I think you might be on mute.
Sorry. Just to clarify, I mentioned myself only because it's a very easy way to do this, but actually my question goes, it's very easy to talk about yourself, but only to say that this actually is reflective of individual experiences that are brought to me as examples, or other people. So thank you for your comment, but please don't think I'm referring to me. It's actually the principle that I'm wanting to get to.
Of course. So from a policy perspective, we do have online safety as one of the top priorities for the company, and we do believe that abuse and harassment don't have a place on our service. We do welcome people to express themselves, but we have clear rules in place to address specifically violence, abuse, and harassment. And as we've discussed, hateful conduct, which has been something that we've worked on over the past 2 years to actually get in a place that we're hoping will meet those community expectations. As I've said, a lot of our control is again on using technology to leverage and to reduce the burden on victims having to report, but also on the design element. And so we've made a number of product changes recently that give people additional control on how they can interact on Twitter in a way that feels safe to them. So one of those instances is conversational controls that allows people to choose who can reply to their tweets. And whenever we introduced this, we actually saw of those who had submitted abuse reports were 3 times more likely to use those settings. And so getting feedback, they were saying this was working, this was helping, this was making Twitter a safer place for them. In terms of where we're seeing the ability to really make sure that we're, again, protecting people before the harm actually occurs, is we're currently testing out, and it actually launched in Australia a couple of months ago. It's called Safety Mode, which is a beta test at the moment that's looking at reducing disruptive or potentially abusive interactions. And so again, the goal is to take that violative content away, or to be able to take it down before it's actually viewed. And we're again trying to improve people's experience online at scale, so that they're able to again participate in that conversation, but not be subject to any sort of abusive actions or conversations that would be harmful. So these are things that we're continuing to iterate on, because as you know, this is all a dynamic space. Nothing here is static. Nothing here we ever think is completely done. We understand that bad actors are always trying to be one step ahead. And so we're continually doing this back and forth with our users to understand what they're experiencing and trying to figure out how we can put them at the forefront of our service to be safe and to feel empowered to be part of the public conversation.
Thank you for that. And some of the conversation earlier this morning was around young people and the importance of how they feel, the concept around agency and around being safe online and how important that was to them. And I guess I keep that in mind in asking questions because it's around everyone being safe online. Your hateful conduct policy, it reads well. The policy makes it clear, or if I take from your submission, that this reads well. The policy makes clear that no one on Twitter may promote violence against or directly attack or threaten other people on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, caste, sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, religious affiliation, age, disability, or serious disease. We also do not allow accounts whose primary purpose is inciting harm towards others on the basis of these comments, these categories. We had some conversation yesterday with other platforms around the threshold used or determined by either algorithms or staff, people looking at complaints around these issues. And some of the conversation was around thresholds. Some of the conversations were around context, the concept of context. I'd just like to ask you, in reference to your hateful conduct policy, specifically given it goes to gender, I wonder whether comments in relation to a Twitter user calling a woman a cavorting whore would be considered to meet the conduct, that would meet the threshold for your hateful conduct policy?
Thank you for the question, Chair. In terms of any sort of specific phrases or terms, from a Twitter perspective, we do allow for certain inflammatory or strident language. That being said, the statement that you just read out, if it were in the context of targeting an individual or in crossing that threshold into abuse, we would, of course, review it under the Twitter rules in terms of service and then take into account any account context, depending again on who was being mentioned, if these accounts followed each other, a number of behavioral signals that would allow us to understand fully what's going on in that situation. So I wouldn't be able to speak to that specifically, but we would, of course, evaluate it against our rules, take the context into consideration, and then make an enforcement decision from there.
Okay, well, I might place this question on notice then and just ask you that in relation to a series of examples given by a well-known and highly respected journalist in Australia, Lee Sales, I'm just wondering what action was taken by Twitter in relation to various comments, and I'm happy to provide those comments that I've researched on notice to you. And just ask you then, given that I am talking about comments that are in the public sphere, and I could go to some others, but to be honest, I actually feel personally quite sick even rereading them again. I've done this yesterday. I don't like it. I'm going to ask you, what action do you take when you do see things, given that you've referenced, professional roles in public policy? What actions do you take when you do see comments like these or publicised comments in the media? Do you take them down? Is there a review? And do you think these comments, which I could continue reading, but you can imagine that was the least offensive one that I started with, do you think that these actually reflect, you talked about making sure your policies align with community standards. Do you think this actually reflects community standards, specifically in relation to the importance of respectful behaviour towards all people, particularly women? And I'll go further. Do you think this is a good example of dehumanisation of an individual?
Thank you, Chair. I wouldn't be able to comment on the specifics at this stage, But I would assure you that our teams would be reviewing this against our terms of service and the Twitter rules, and would be taking enforcement actions that would be consistent with what they find violative. I will note, and you had mentioned Lee Sales, and we've worked with the ABC in a number of regards, being very cognizant and aware and alive to the fact that we are seeing trends that are attacking both female journalists, but also female politicians. We know that this is something that is quite complex, and we have dedicated teams that are working on how these interactions with individual targeting or again scaled targeting it can be managed, and how we can ensure that we're taking action to actually look at the behaviors that would cause harm in the short term and the long term, so in acute and chronic settings. I just want to reassure that this is something that we are getting better at with the scaled enforcement, and we're working very hard to also ensure that we're alive to any situations that come up, especially around current events. I'm so sorry, Chair. I can't hear you. You might be on mute.
Thank you for letting me know that.
Yes.
I think what you're saying is not dissimilar to what we heard yesterday, that you're indicating it depends on context.
There is some language that I think would be clearly violative of certain policies we have in place. But if we go through a number of examples, again, I know that, yes, context does matter, and that we're looking at a number of signals to make these determinations. Apologies.
So this is the one that I'm really trying to understand, because it was a new concept to me when I was told that, you know, looking at these sorts of things depended on context. So I'd like to ask you, in terms of platforms, I'd like to ask Twitter, if you could give me an example of the context in which it is okay to call somebody on Twitter, a public platform, a cavorting whore.
Thank you for the question, Chair. I will be clear that there are instances where we have seen certain phrases or strident language that are sometimes used in a slang way, or they're used as a community, as even terms sometimes of friendship. Our former VP, Del Harvey, used to use the example that, hey, BITCH could be seen as a greeting to a friend, or it could be seen as abuse depending on the context. And as you'll see, especially you know, within a younger demographic, that there are terms that are sometimes used in a way that might seem on its face to be abusive, but at other times would actually be seen as appropriate language between people that know each other.
Sure, but I've given a very direct example that didn't include the word BITCH. Cavorting whore, given you've given me something different, I'm just going to ask you, is there any context in Twitter's hateful content policy, is there any context that you can think of under which that would be seen to be acceptable and not hateful content or abusive content? I'll be honest, I can't think of one, but I'd like to hear of one if you know of one.
Thank you, Chair. I might have misunderstood your question in the first instance. As I had noted earlier, whenever there would be that word or that phrase used in the context of a direct targeting of an individual, then that could run afoul of our abusive and harassment policy or our hateful conduct policy. So again, depending on the context, it could be violative or it could not. And that's where that extra detail and information becomes important.
Okay, so I would appreciate then an answer on notice as to what context, directly that phrase would actually not meet your hateful conduct policy, please. I cannot envisage, and I have got literally 3 pages of these, but I can't get off this one because I don't understand why Twitter's hateful conduct policy does not apply to a degrading, dehumanising, demeaning phrase directed at any woman, at any individual, I do not understand it, and I, for one, cannot imagine a single context in which that might be considered to be not abusive. So I would very much appreciate a considered response that goes directly to the direct question that I've asked there in relation to how Twitter's hateful conduct policy lines up against statements such as that. And given that you use the word BITCH, that is not necessarily offensive, I might ask you in relation to this one, I hate this effing BITCH, comma, pinko, slut, BITCH, whether that is considered to be hateful conduct policy or not, whether that breaches your standards, what action was taken in relation to a comment such as that, or would be taken against such a person posting this. And I'll ask a series of others as well, but those two specific ones. And I guess I'm going to come to this because you've talked before about the platform being one that, if I go back to your submission, abuse and harassment have no place on Twitter, and our teams take action against harmful content under the Twitter rules. I just would like to understand what sort of action is taken. And if these comments, which are directed at public figures, if it's hard for public figures to get them taken down, how much harder is it for young people or for an individual with no ability to be able to reach out perhaps beyond the contact option that Twitter or other platforms may provide? How much harder is it for the ordinary individual to be able to deal with such hateful, degrading, demeaning, dehumanising abuse directed at online platforms? And I guess in answering this, I'd ask you to go further, because it's not simply a statement that is said verbally, it's something that's online. And you were talking before about blocking, which is a very powerful thing to do. It's great to be able to block somebody. I blocked an individual recently and I did it for a reason. I understand that. But the comments still remain there. They're still able to be read by other people. It's still derogatory, demeaning, dehumanising conduct that remains there unless action is taken against that particular issue. So my question is, how do you apply your Twitter hateful conduct policy to ensure that the Twitter platform is safe for all?
Thank you, Chair, for sharing those insights with us. And we'd be very happy to take these specific questions on notice and come back to you with more thorough, detailed answers. With regards to how people are able to report content to us, I would assure you that we have various means between what's in the app and what's in the Help Center. And whenever they do report content to us, they get an automatic email back from Twitter support that confirms that they've received a report. And then once our teams have reviewed that and taken action or have any further information to provide or additional context they need, then they do email that person back so that they know if there's been a resolution or if there needs to be further information provided. So we do really strive to have a feedback loop so that people, anyone who's on Twitter, and we even have reporting options for people who don't have a Twitter account but see something on the platform and they would like to report it to us, they can do so. So we do work very hard to have that open communication and to make sure that people do understand what we consider violative, what actions have been taken, and be able to close that loop. But happy to take this all on notice and to come back to you.
I would just add to that, Chair, that one of the challenges that we contend with is the question of what we would call a single slur, something deeply offensive and strident, such as the one that you just described, and where we're getting better at the scaled work with heuristics and behavioural signals. So we're making stronger progress with ban evaders and repeat kind of chronic replying abusers because our machine learning and our AI capabilities are improving faster. I think some of the instances that you've described I'd like, and Cara and I would like to take those back to our internal teams for review. I would reiterate here, public policy is not responsible for reviewing content or making kind of in the instance responses to those without being able to see the tweets. And in fact, it's not our role at the company to make assignations or determinations of what is violative or not. So I want to be clear here, we're not trying to evade the questions, but we are not the team. We are not the trust and safety teams or the Twitter service teams or the specialist teams who deal with content pertaining to young people or to gender-based violence and abuse. That's not our area of specialty, but we would be very happy to take back any list, have those reviewed and report back quickly to you in the committee on those cases you've described.
Thank you. I would appreciate that. And just by way of reference, the earlier comment I read out was not one just picked out. I actually had, it's actually contained in Kate Ellis's book, Sex, Lies and Question Time, why the successes and struggles of women in Australia's parliament matter to us all. And there are a number of other examples that I could easily and happily cite, but because of the time frame, I think the point is well made. But my concern is that your platform, when I read your submission, I was so pleased to see it addressed, or it seemed to address gender, and yet the actual practical outworking of that doesn't appear to be the real lived experience of the ordinary individual in Australia when it comes to allowing this content online. I wonder whether I'll ask some other questions. I'll come back to this. How do women, in particular, given we're talking about some examples of gendered, what I would call hateful content, I understand that may be different, but I would call that. In a practical sense, how do women access assistance from Twitter if they are subject to this sort of attack? Is there a mechanism by which, if after the initial algorithm determination, is there a way that they can continue to access support or a right of appeal or to go higher up? How does that process work?
Thank you, Chair. I can take you quickly through our process that applies for everybody on the platform. And if you have any more specific questions, please let me know. But in a first instance, if somebody is wanting to report content to us, then they can either report it by account, they can report it by tweet, or they can report a DM. And when they report that content, it goes to our Twitter service teams that are able to review it against our policies. If there is an edge case, our trust and safety teams are able to make a determination against how our rules or terms of service need to be interpreted. And then there's actually a response then sent back to the user to let them know what the determination was. And if there's additional context that's needed, sometimes our teams will ask them for additional information. If there's been further behavior that has come through since that first report, they're able to add that in. And then if they feel like our decision was not the right one, then they're able to appeal it. And they can continue to have that appeal process go forward, and they can continue to add new information or additional behaviors or interactions that have occurred on the platform to that case. And we'll continue to review it, and we'll continue to iterate so that they can build on instances, because we understand it's not usually just a one-off sort of situation, that usually this is an interaction that can have multiple tweets or conversations along the way. And so we do have that back and forth, but we always ensure again to have that feedback loop so that once a determination is made, it's communicated back to the original user.
I'm not sure how much of the previous conversation with our earlier witness you were able to hear. But there was and I'm just trying to find my notes on it and can't at the moment, but there was a very interesting concept in relation to the consideration of do no harm. And the concept of do no harm is set against the context outlined before about, context and all these other things. The back and forth in itself and having to justify, to defend, to seek to prosecute, to have harmful material removed, isn't that process somehow in itself quite a difficult one for somebody who has been harmed by attacks such as, whether I use the reference to the other thing or there's so many millions of different variations. And you're right, sometimes it's iterative in the course of multiple things. It's not necessarily just one. But is there any consideration under Twitter's hateful content policy or harmful content policy of the principle of do no harm? And how do you weigh that up with, I guess, your other considerations? Hateful conduct policy, I apologise.
Thank you, Chair. With regards to the back and forth, we agree with you. One of the key things that we've been trying to build and that we've actually been utilizing is technology to reduce the burden on victims of abuse. And since the time that we started working on this 2 years ago, we now have 65% of the reports that are surfaced to our content moderation team for review come from automated technology. And so we are trying to move, as you've alluded to moving that burden off of people that might be overwhelmed or under pressure from abuse happening on the platform. And we're trying to have a lot more points of intervention to ensure that when things start to become borderline or move into that abusive kind of end of the spectrum, that either we're downranking that kind of information so it's not visible, that we are removing it more at scale, or that we have things like prompts that come up when somebody's trying to tweet something out and we've detected something that we believe might be abusive. They get a prompt that says, "This looks abusive." And it suggests to them to rewrite it. And we've seen that actually be incredibly helpful and got good feedback from the users that participated in our public consultation around that prompt. And we actually introduced a whole new host of prompts that we're currently running across the platform to have people reconsider what they're putting out there into the online realm before actually putting it into a tweet so that it would be visible. So that's part of the public conversation and the healthy conversation mission that we're trying to drive towards. And we're constantly looking at what kind of incentives are our products and policies creating, and what do we need to do to change them to make sure that we're always going back to that mission. So we agree with you that that burden needs to be taken off of the user, and we're trying to increasingly use our technology to do that.
I'm conscious there are many questions from other members of the committee. I think I'll finish on this. I was really struck by a policy of the New South Wales government looking at family and domestic violence, and the name of the policy is Staying Home, Leaving Violence, flipping it, if you like, such that the perpetrator is the one who leaves, not the victim. And I've always been struck by that principle since I first heard the name, Staying Home, Leaving Violence. My question is, what would need to be done to provide a more strident, in your view, should there be more strident consequences for perpetrators? Because at the moment, the consequence is you can block, but they remain online, or, as happens to, many individuals, you just leave Twitter altogether so as not to be subject to it. But those people who choose to participate and behave that way too often remain on the platform. What could be better done to address that? And I guess saying that with reference to the policy I was saying before about staying home, leaving violence, and flipping it so that the onus is on the person who has caused harm rather than the person who is being harmed.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take this on first instance, and then I might hand over to Kathleen, who I think had some thoughts also. just quickly, I'm not familiar with that particular piece of legislation or draft regulation in New South Wales, and so I will make sure to go look at it after this hearing.
That's okay.
But
The
just
heading. Yeah, the heading.
heading.
I think it's the thing I'm referring to. Just the flipping of it. Yeah.
Understood. So to that regard, I would say that again, a lot of the automation that we're working on is looking to do that, to really ensure that people that do violate our rules are taken off the platform. And we do have a strong ban evasion policy that once someone has been permanently suspended and they try to get back on the platform, that they're unable to do so, and that we're getting much better at being able to keep them off. The quick thing that I would just note is that with the Online Safety Act coming into effect over the weekend, it is my understanding that there will be stronger powers given to the eSafety Commissioner. She's had the ability to issue end user notices under the child cyber bullying scheme and the non-consensual nudity scheme that was under the Enhancing Online Safety Act for many years. But under the new Online Safety Act, with the adult cyber abuse scheme, there will be, I think, a lot more room for the regulator to step in this regard around perpetrators, and again, to really focus on end users and their behavior, especially if it's happening across multiple platforms. As you know, we are just the one company, just Twitter, the Bluebird app, and sometimes there are things that are happening across a multitude of platforms that we just aren't aware of. And this is an area where the eSafety Commissioner is uniquely placed to be able to have that bird's eye view on some of these issues. I might hand over to Kathleen if she had any other thoughts.
Thank you, Cara. Thank you, Chair. Just briefly to add that from our point of view, some of this type of targeted abuse is taking place in a wider context and in a wider information ecosystem, and that there's some room there for redressal and understanding of those behaviours within that wider set, rather than being seen just within the precepts of a single platform. That's not really, in our experience, how the information flows or how and where the bad actors go and behave. This has been one of the findings too of research we've been conducting over the past 2 years, with intensive multi-stage consultations with a range of domain experts, subject matter experts, non-profits, mental health experts and online experts, to look at these issues more deeply, particularly as we deepen our work in the machine learning space. And one of the things that came up repeatedly when looking at how high-profile individuals are targeted was, what are the perspectives and what voices are needed to be brought forward to help protect those? What are a full range of harm reduction efforts that can be undertaken beyond keep up, take down, or chase off platform kind of set of issues that we're seeing? And one of the things that also came through that I think has to be mentioned here is the balance of harm reduction and freedom of expression. So how to avoid any unintended consequences of removing legitimate speech from marginalised groups themselves, and how we address the desire and need for debate, even when it becomes extremely heated in context. As you know, each tweet is up to 280 characters. Threads can be very long. Conversations can go on for seconds, days, weeks, and much longer. And we're very aware too that people in positions of a very high profile nature may themselves as leaders use language or speak up in ways that can be perceived to be creating an environment of permissibility for abuse. And the coarsening of the political debate, of public debate, the polarisation between groups is something that we're also studying and working on with partners. It remains a live effort, and it's one of the reasons why the Twitter rules and our terms of service are living documents. We are updating them every week and every month, given how rapid the changes are around these debates and around how we can move forward to make sure that women feel safe on the platform and all vulnerable and underrepresented groups have a place and a voice and feel safe and welcome on Twitter.
Thank you very much. I am conscious of time. Questions from Ms. Hammond?
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Reen, I was actually going to start with a bit of a disagreement with something or questioning of something you said earlier, but I actually want to start off now with agreeing with what you just said. I think that what we're all grappling with here, and which Twitter and with all the social media and all of our platforms have to grapple with, is that concept of harm reduction versus freedom of speech. Because we do know our social media platforms, they do enable people to speak out and to reduce harms and to bring attention to things. Sometimes, as you've pointed out in your submission, they do it in an anonymous way, but they can shine light where harm is being done. And we all want to keep that aspect of it. But then there's that countervailing, that the other side of it where there is harm happening. On the polarisation issue, I also agree with you. It's sometimes we've got to look at this in the context of a chicken and egg. It's very easy to say, well, Twitter and social media is making us more polarised. But the answer to that is, well, really? Or are they just responding to what is happening in society? So I'm pleased, really pleased to know that all of the social media companies are investing in research, as are our mental health bodies and research bodies, in looking at these sorts of issues, because I do think we need to get an understanding of that. The issue that I did want to take was with the comment you made earlier in response to some of the examples the Chair was raising, when you said we're not the trust and safety teams, we're the public policy teams, we can't answer those specific questions. And my point to you is, and I fully respect that you are the public policy teams, but in order to be able to do the public policy role effectively and engage, I would have thought that your trust and safety teams should actually be advising you of these sorts of issues. The evidence that the Chair put before you, was here, has been publicly available for some time. I would have thought that, your health and your trust and safety teams should have briefed you on these and briefed you on how to actually respond to questions like the examples that the Chair gave you. And if they didn't, was it by intent so that you didn't have to put those answers on the public record, or was it an oversight?
We work closely with our trust and safety teams and our review teams every day. And to be very clear, we're not seeking to obfuscate or avoid the questions. But I will be really honest, Cara and I talk to external stakeholders, people from communities every day across Australia and New Zealand, for me and the wider team across the Asia Pacific. And we are pretty clear on where our policies are going, what they are, and I hope that we've helped explain some of that today, and we're happy to continue to do so. It does get tricky when you give us a very particular case. It doesn't have context except what you're reading out, and we're being asked to commentate on it. It is harder for us. So the promise here is to come back to you as soon as possible with those answers. We're not seeking to avoid them whatsoever, but it is harder for us given how much content we deal with every day, how many cases and escalations, and the conversations that we have. We regret that abuse can and does happen, and we're seeking to show here the efforts we're undertaking to combat that. But it is there. It is evolving. It is a fast-moving area of work where we have to undertake continuing research investment and making sure that a combination of human and technological review is moving as quickly as possible. But I hope that the committee is reassured that Twitter is here in good faith, seeking to answer these questions, but being pinned on one tweet and the next is extremely difficult for us, except in some cases where we were very, very directly involved. And even then, I would have to say that an additional reason to come on notice is that technically within the Twitter rules and our terms of service, public policy isn't permitted to speak publicly about individual accounts. So we would want to go back to the teams and bring you that information, but make sure that we're doing it in the right way and in a non-violative way when it comes to privacy and the rules as well. I'm sorry if we've got a miss on any individual.
Yeah,
there.
well, it was also, I mean, I don't think that the chair actually referred to the individual account. She used the language that was used in the account. But leaving that to one side, and I accept that you're not part of the trust and safety teams. You mentioned before that people can escalate, can make a complaint and that they're then reviewed. Do you know the turnaround? They're reviewed by the trust and safety teams. Do you know the turnaround time for complaints?
Happy to jump in real fast, Ms. Hammond. In terms of turnarounds, it's going to depend on what content is actually reported to us. So it initially goes to our Twitter service team, which is an operational team that applies the rules and the terms of service that we have. And then if it needs further review, if it's an edge case, if it's novel and it's something that we haven't seen before, our trust and safety teams are able to come in and help interpret how the rules would be applied in that situation.
So
the turnaround.
Yeah, sorry. So do you have, like KPIs for your operational team? You've got to deal with something within 24 hours or escalate it. Do you have those sort of internal mechanisms as part of your operating protocols?
So we have a lot of different SLAs, or as you said,
Yeah.
KPIs, especially that are usually set by different legal regimes, depending on what part of the world we're working in. So as you know, here in Australia, we have the OSA coming into effect on Sunday, and that has 24-hour turnaround times. So within those regimes and within those reporting mechanisms and enforcement queues that are associated with the e-safety office, that would fall within that 24-hour turnaround time. So that again, sometimes it sets and it varies depending on which geographic location we're talking about. But yes, again, generally, if we're just looking at this kind of turnaround time writ large, you're going to have things that are in a certain end of the spectrum, things like terrorist content, child sexual exploitative material, that have the highest turnaround times because we are expeditiously looking to review that. When you're looking at the other end of the spectrum, looking at spam reports or things that are low level, then that's going to be a little bit of a longer turnaround. So there's a whole spectrum, but usually it's governed by the locale.
Great, thanks. Must make it pretty complicated because I imagine there's different legislation. Well, there would be different legislation in every jurisdiction.
Yes.
You must have a very active legal team. Your trust and safety teams. Now, I might have to put these questions on notice because I'm also mindful of the time. But I would like, for the record, the number of users in Australia, the ages of the users and the gender, the numbers, full-time equivalent employed in trust and safety teams as compared with the number of employees in other aspects of Twitter operations. How many of them are based in Australia? Similar sort of comparison, employees in Australia and a proportion of those that are in the trust and safety teams. And some data on number of complaints, no privacy issues there. And I think that some of that information you might have already publicly released, but the amount of complaints, I'm only concerned about Australia at the moment, the amount of complaints, the turnaround times, and how many actually do need to be escalated, because I imagine in your operational team would probably sort out a lot of them. But I imagine that there's, you keep data on how much need to be escalated. So if I can put that all on notice, the Secretariat will have, the transcript will have picked that all up, so you don't have to have jotted it down. Are there any that you can address quickly and off the top right now?
Thanks, Ms. Hammond. Off the top, many of those things will have to come back to you on notice. I will note that some of the information that you requested around takedowns related to Twitter rules in terms of service within Australia were addressed in our disinformation report that we provided mid last year. So happy to go back and pull some of that out for you, but we will come back to you as quickly as possible. Thank you.
As I said, thank you both very much for your open and generous responses to our questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions from Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chair. And just quickly, it's a shame we haven't got more time here. We really should have had at least 2 hours for Twitter. So we'll try and be quick and put other questions on notice. My first question, Yesterday, we heard from witnesses from Facebook and Google, YouTube, about their policies of so-called medical misinformation. Does Twitter have a similar policy, and what is it?
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for the question. Yes, we do have a similar policy. It's related to COVID-19 misinformation specifically, and it's mostly focused on trying to minimize any sort of real-world harm that could come from any misinformation that would be connected to COVID-19.
Okay, how do you determine what is real-world harm and what is alternate expert medical opinion?
So our COVID-19 misinformation policy was put together in conjunction with a number of not only medical experts and doctors and epidemiologists, but also with a number of government organizations, not only the WHO at an international level, but we work directly with the Department of Health here in Australia as we started to see the pandemic emerging in January 2020 around what kind of guidance they were putting forward, what kind of information and recommendations they were putting towards the general public.
If a qualified medical doctor has an alternative opinion, is he able to post that on your site?
We allow certain information to be put forward on Twitter in the spirit of diversity of opinions. However, going back to the offline harm impact, that's where we're going to be looking at if there needs to be any sort of point of intervention or enforcement action taken.
Okay, let me give you an example. Dr. Brian Tyson, a doctor in the USA, has recently written a book, Overcoming the COVID Darkness, How Two Doctors Successfully Treated 7,000 Patients, where he documents how he, through his clinics, treated 7,000 patients using hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin with 0 deaths and only a handful of hospitalizations. How can a doctor like that, qualified medical practitioner with such experience, be deplatformed and banned from Twitter?
Mr. Kelly, I might just jump in here. So for Twitter, we follow. So this is a really difficult topic. We've updated our own COVID-19 policies more than 4 times since we established the first one in March 2020. Like the terms of service and the Twitter rules, it's a living document and a living set of rules given the rapidly changing nature of the pandemic. Like any real humanitarian crisis and disaster, the information that might be true at the beginning of it may not be the same at the centre or at the end. So we have relied very heavily on the most trusted and the most credible voices to help shape those policies.
But surely someone that has treated over 7,000 COVID patients, surely, if I just take that point you're talking about there, surely someone that has treated over 7,000 COVID patients should be a trusted authority. And yet Twitter, you have deleted his account and you've blocked him from your platform. So the public is being denied the opportunity to hear what this medical expert says. I don't see how that is in the public interest. I see that as suppression of alternate expert opinion, which in a free democratic society, we should be free to hear the expert opinions of these medical doctors. But you seem to disagree.
I don't think we're in disagreement here. We may be in disagreement on point, as in that when we take down those accounts, it's for violation of prevailing in particular parts of the policy, Mr. Kelly. So I would say here we do follow the advice of the World Health Organization, the Australian Department of Health, our chief medical officers. We need a framework that we can stand by.
Okay, do you think they are the single source? Do you think the World Health Organization is a single source of truth that always gets it right? Or should other expert medical opinions be able to challenge what they are saying?
We allow hundreds and thousands of expert opinions on Twitter to engage in debates, and we allow the questioning, but we do not allow under our policies the promotion of either disproven or discredited medicines.
How can a doctor who has treated 7,000 COVID patients, detailed it in a study, a report, which is being currently under peer review, has written a book on this. How can he be? How can his views be so-called determined by wrong? Isn't his opinion just an alternate opinion that the general public should be allowed to hear?
We know that this is difficult, Mr. Kelly. Not every study, not every book is credible just because it has a lot of people or it is published or it is, and not all research is equal. So we do need a frame and a foundation to stand by. We're the most credible
So effectively, if someone has if a respected medical person has alternative advice from so-called government opinion or government advice, in that case, aren't you just a propaganda arm of the government?
Mr. Kelly, just in terms of future questions, please, I'm asking that the witness respond to Mr. Kelly's questions, but I also am just indicating I'm mindful of time and just ask that after this question that you return to the terms of reference in framing your question.
Thank you. I would note that the terms of reference are harm being done, and the proposition I am putting to the witnesses from Twitter, that they are causing harm to Australians and in fact to the world, because they are not allowing and they are censoring alternate medical opinion from experts. That just because it differs from so-called government health advice at the time doesn't make it misinformation. It is an alternate opinion.
Mr. Kelly, I'm happy to jump in here. With regards to any specifics, we would be happy to take that on notice and come back to you. Again, we don't have these reports or this specific case in front of us. I don't believe the materials were provided prior to the hearing, and so we'd be happy to address this more specifically at a later time. And one other thing I'd just add is that, as Kathleen noted earlier, we're having these scientific understandings of the pandemic develop, and we've observed the emergence of a lot of persistent conspiracy theories and rhetoric that's been unfounded in research. So we're trying very hard.
But because of time, I'm not. So you were suggesting that Dr. Brian Tyson, a registered medical professional that has treated 7,000 patients, is somehow engaging in some type of conspiracy theory?
No, what I'm saying is that we've seen a lot of emerging trends evolve over the past 2 years, and we're just trying to keep a pace with the way that our policies are meeting those changes. So I'm not familiar with Dr. Tyson personally. Again, happy to come back to you with a bit more detail on that specifically.
Okay, I'll put that in. One final question I've got. Today I go on Twitter and I see a particular person from my electorate is described as a massive F-head with the word F-U-C-K written there. You go to it also, it says suck, S-H-I-T, then the word C word after. And when you go in, it says F off C, not with those words spelled out, 4-letter words. How does that get through your profiles? How is it possible that that can be on your feed with thousands of likes, and at the same time you're blocking someone like a medical professional like Dr. Tyson?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Kelly. I'm unsure of the specific tweet that you're referring to. As we've discussed previously with the chair, we do allow strident language and inflammatory comments, but if it is going over the threshold of abuse, and I'm not sure if this tweet has been reported or not, but we would be able to review it under our policies and, if violative, remove it and possibly take further enforcement action. If you would like to send that to us, I'd be happy to have our teams take a look.
Thank you, Chair. Because of time, I would have a lot of other questions I'd like to put on notice, but because of time, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. I appreciate excuse me, your consideration, Mr. Kelly. Final question from Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Just wrapping up this session, I just thought asking a broad question. You're not able to provide the committee with any insights or advice on the effectiveness of the new reforms to the Online Safety Act in dealing with the issues that have been raised in this hearing, are you? You don't have an experience of the operation of the new reforms to the Online Safety Act to be able to speak to in this hearing?
Correct. Thank you, Deputy Chair. I apologize. I was having some problems with sound on my end. No, since the law hasn't officially gone into effect, we don't have anything that we would be able to provide. But once the law does come into effect and we go through the implementation and compliance processes, we would be happy to revert back with any feedback.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to committee members and particularly to our witnesses. We appreciate your time and also the extended amount of time that you gave us, and I do thank you for your attendance here today. If you've been asked to provide additional information and for further questions on notice, could you please forward your responses through to the Secretariat by the 4th of February 2022. Just to let you know that you will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. We'll just suspend for, as is becoming a bit of a habit, we'll suspend for a minute or so just to allow for our next witnesses to appear. Thank you very much for your time. Everyone in attendance for your time today. This is the public hearing of the Select Committee on Social Media and Online Safety via video and teleconference, and I now welcome representatives of Mental Health Australia to give evidence today and ask that for the Hansard record for you to please state your full names and the capacities in which you appear before the committee.
So Matt Berryman, Chair of Mental Health Australia.
And I'm Leanne Beagley. I'm the CEO at Mental Health Australia.
Thank you very much. Just some formalities to start with, to advise you that although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'd like to thank you for providing a submission and an opening statement to the committee for consideration, and ask if you would like to make any further additional comments or opening statement before we proceed to discussion from the committee.
No additional comments. No additional comments, Chair. I might just take a brief moment to read out the opening statement to frame our conversation. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people as the traditional custodians of the lands and where I am meeting from today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Also would like to acknowledge the leadership, the House Select Committee, the submission parties and all those appearing to continue to strive for the best practice of using social media and ensuring our youth are protected from potential harms and the negative use of social media. In December last year, I was appointed Chair of Mental Health Australia, which is the peak national non-government organisation representing the Australian mental health sector. As members span the full range of the mental health ecosystem, and I wish to acknowledge some of our members and commend their submissions provided to the committee, especially Reach Out, Origin and Butterfly. I come to the committee also with a unique experience in the technology sector, working with and being challenged by big tech. I've built multiple tech companies globally, including Unlocked, which was a technology company in 7 markets internationally, had millions of users, but ultimately fell foul of Google, who without cause terminated our business in 2018, just before our IPO here on the ASX. That civil damages case is currently still in court in California. Having spent a lot of time as partners, working with social media companies and their executives, using their platforms as a consumer whilst being targeted personally, in addition to many discussions with ministers globally, select committees, and specifically the DOJ and FTC in the US. I have unique insights into their operations and also their ways of working with regulators and governments that may prove useful. Technology is entrenched in our lives and the community, especially the younger generations, which has brought many positives, including connection, information discovery, creativity, and communication that otherwise wouldn't have once been possible. However, it's also come at a cost for many, including parents, their children, and their mental health, due to the freedom that has allowed social media companies to become so powerful that now they are trying, and to be honest, doing a good job at making up their own rules. From my experience, the thought or belief that they'll do the right thing is fallacy. Quite simply, big tech and the social media companies will put profit over people. And unless government intervene to protect our digital way of life now and into the future, we cannot trust big tech and social media companies to do it themselves, despite their many hollow promises. Finally, just I want to thank the committee for the invitation to speak, and happy to answer any questions moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Berriman. We had a robust discussion earlier this morning with one of the online platforms, and we've had similar robust discussions as well earlier in the week. And I guess I go to the question that I have around policies of the platforms around online safety versus the actual outworking of it, particularly when it comes to community standards. I know there's a code of conduct for misinformation and disinformation that's been developed. I'm actually talking here about online harms to the individual in terms of abuse. I think the word has been used, I think it's a very good word, dehumanisation, very good, apt way of sort of describing what abuse does. You said, and you read this out, I'll just read it again from your opening statement. From my experience, the thought or belief they will do the right thing is a fallacy. Quite simply, big tech and social media companies put profit over people, and unless government intervene to protect our digital way of life now and into the future, we cannot trust big tech and social media companies to do so themselves despite many hollow promises. I don't know how much of the earlier Twitter conversation you got in relation to their content, their hateful content policy, and my example of some things that are on Twitter. But my question is it really the role of government, how much is it the role of government to intervene versus an expectation and a requirement that these platforms should at the very least adhere to their own, adhere to the community standards expected outlined in their policies? Is this resulting from that this hasn't been spelled out enough? There's no sort of legal framework. Should we require a legal framework? Or is it simply that big tech are hiding behind, if for want of a better word, that there are some walls and some statements that don't necessarily come out in reality, and there could be more that could be done by big tech to keep people safe online? Sorry, that's quite a convoluted question, but hopefully, Mr. Berriman, you can...
No, it's a great question, Chair. And I think it is multifaceted and multi-leveled, and I think your approach is right. I think that the first instance is they believe, their policies are the right policies, and, whether you believe or don't believe that those policies are the right policies, I think that's a separate question we'll come back to later. The governance of whether they address those policies accurately is also an issue, and we've seen many instances, and I think ministers over the last few days and in history of people bringing up these challenges, personal lived experiences we've seen from Erin Molan and others during the course of the select committee hearing, is they don't, do they have the capability to govern themselves? And I think the challenge where I talk about profit over people is ultimately, if they feel there is a financial benefit to allow that behaviour to continue, they will continue to obfuscate the chance to actually remedy those issues. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen, standards in the community and standards traditional publishing and media companies that are adhered to around defamation, and obviously the criminal and civil laws that adhere to the media companies here in Australia, that why are big tech companies able to write their own rules and mark their own homework is one of the questions that, when government needs to intervene, seems to be when there's a failing of their own systems, which seems to be at the current discussion point now.
You made a reference to profit over people. and a further reference just in your earlier answer there. I'm wondering if you could outline how in your view does allowing, I want to be careful with my words, some of this content that stands, that is the subject of a lot of concern by individuals and mum and dads that I talk to around Australia, and a lot of people. So they're concerned about the sort of stuff that's online sometimes that does stand. How does that contribute to profit over, how does that contribute to a platform's profit? Could you just explain, for the benefit of those who don't have a technology background, how you make a link between the two?
Yep, great. It's a great question. So effectively, as we know, social media companies predominantly rely on, and Twitter have tried different angles on membership, predominantly rely on advertising revenue. And ultimately, more impressions and more users equals more advertising revenue, no matter what content they're reading or distributing or commenting on or sharing. And therefore, great example recently, it was quite public internationally around the Wall Street Journal, bringing attention to, strategy teams within Instagram and Facebook to basically build a strategy to drive higher usage for young women underage that have eating disorder challenges and or body image issues by feeding them continual content in and around that area. Not only affects their mental health, but makes them create extra content, read more stories, continue to scroll through Instagram, drive more ad revenue, and that algorithm is being used to actually increase their impressions as such, no matter the harm of the content they're producing to the consumer.
We heard before a conversation around from the National Mental Health Commission, a conversation around. It was a very helpful conversation where we were talking about content and context of that content, and we were then talking about we're talking about content and context of that content, and then the principle of do no harm. I'm just wondering, as Chair of Mental Health Australia, in your experience, and to both representatives of Mental Health Australia, in your experience, what have been some of the concerns that have been raised with you by stakeholder groups and individuals about some of the harm online caused as a result of some of the comments that are made that are allowed to stand, or abuse directed online that is allowed to stand, or is not removed once addressed?
Thank you, Chair. So I've just been Chair for a little over a month now, so I've engaged with members so far, but I'll let Leanne talk to some of the impacts of social media and the mental health harms.
Thank you, Chair, for the question. So I'd firstly point the committee to the 3 submissions that have been provided by experts working in this area, both Origin Youth Health and Reach Out, and Eating Disorders, Peak Body Butterfly Foundation, because they have provided some detailed research and advice, both about the harms, but also about the benefits, in fact, of social media and the opportunities that exist to use some of the technology to identify when people are troubled, or help them stay on track in relation to some of their issues or engagement, for example, around support systems and connections and so on. But I guess what you're asking particularly is around the harms, and people living with mental ill health and their families are worried about the challenges in that social media amplify for people who maybe are disconnected and lonely, are troubled by particular aspects of how they present, the competitive aspects of being online and comparing themselves, potentially body image and other issues, to others, and so on. And so, that the point that I wasn't privileged to listen to the Commission this morning when they gave evidence, but my guess is that they would have been also balancing this challenge about how do we maximise the benefits of social media. We certainly use it ourselves at Mental Health Australia for dissemination of health and wellbeing information, particularly around World Mental Health Day, and opportunities for people to support their health and well-being. So we use social media in a positive way, but it's about balancing that against the harms that are possible for people, particularly young people, and particularly when they feel disempowered or disconnected or unable to challenge what's coming through on their media feeds.
If you were making recommendations to this committee, would there be any specific recommendations that you might make in relation to whether it be, if I look at with reference to the terms of reference, particularly in relation to the extent to which algorithms permit, increase or reduce online harms to Australians, and how we might be able to better address that, and any other sort of proposals? And I think I'm referring specifically to big tech, to platforms at the moment, and that's probably the context in which I'm asking that question.
Did you want to answer that, Matt?
Yeah, so I think obviously there's quite a lot that goes into, I suppose, the secret sauce of the big tech algorithms, and they've become so complex, I suppose, and so intelligent to work for their benefit, obviously. And I think what the do no harm is a really interesting concept of how the algorithms would have a framework to minimise, and like Leanne said, I do believe there's quite a lot of benefit in social media and quite a lot of benefit in the big tech companies of what products they've brought to the world. There's absolutely no doubting that, and we're not saying that the solution should be to turn them off or over-regulate them, because I think that's absolutely going too far. But I do think, for the minority, and especially for the vulnerable, where there are specific, certain areas of the ecosystem, especially in mental health, but also in the community, where it feels like there needs to be greater levels of protection, and there needs to be defined areas in the do no harm, potentially regulation around that, to ensure they do adhere to that standard, and the standard that the community would expect, and the standard that the community expects in reporting of mental ill health or suicide, or the community expects of what our media companies report and how they report. And I think that's now, it feels a disconnect has been that the social media companies have written their own rules, where all other publishers and businesses that are disseminating information and creating content have a different set of rules and standards that the community and the wider sector have to obviously work within. So I think that's now about extending that framework to actually include social media into what is required in the community standards. And I think what I'm trying to say is we can't expect them to set the community standards for us, because they'll never put the person over the profit, and therefore we need to be actually actively creating that framework for them.
Thank you very much. Questions to Ms. Hammond?
Look, hello, thank you both for appearing. Mr. Berriman, I think you just nailed it, something that I've been reflecting on for the last couple of weeks, in relation to, we shouldn't expect, nor should we want, our social media companies to be setting the community standards, because they are driven by profit. And there's nothing wrong with profit, just as you say, social media, the platforms themselves, it's not about putting them out of existence. But we shouldn't be, and we have been effectively allowing them to do that, haven't we?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting, I was reflecting on that this morning around, like my background is building tech companies. I invest venture capital. So in the sense of the word, capitalism, I believe in the model of capitalism, and I actually understand what they're trying to achieve from a business perspective. But our role, and I think the reason why this select committee is here, is to actually create the right environment for them that protects the community. And in our business, when I launched Unlocked, so a very simple education of that business was when you unlocked your phone, you would see an ad or a piece of content that would sit above Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and we would give a return of that advertising dollar back to the customer to pay off their phone bill or their streaming service, or here in Australia, Flybuys points. Now, we had a very interesting decision to make very early of what kind of content and ads were we going to show those people. And we could have made a lot more money by showing content that would have been harmful, or potentially advertisers who wanted to reach certain demographics at certain times of the day that we chose not to. And I think that's the do no harm, and it has to start at the top. And I think what's interesting is when you look at the News Bargaining Code, what that really did was, when I listened to the different proposals and having spoken to a lot of the country managers here who supposedly run the country for those companies, they're glorified PR spokespeople and actually have no ability to change or legislate or do anything in their organisations that doesn't come from head office. And I think, the fact you've got Mark Zuckerberg, you've got Sundar Pichai and others actively speaking to the government when it got down to the end of the News Bargaining Code was because they were forced to the table. And I think I would hope that something similar would happen in this sense, where we protect the community but actually get the decision makers to the table on this key issue. And I think we led the way in the world with the News Bargaining Code on how we brought that to a head. And I just think, there's a lot of the community I speak to, especially since taking on the official role, but even just as you all do with your community and constituents, there's so much concern around what world our children especially are going to grow up in with the social media challenges that are out there in the market at the moment. And this feels like a great time to actually change that for the better.
Yeah, but we have had social media for some time now, haven't we? But I think about 2007, is it? 2005, 2007, did the platform start to?
Yeah, but it's definitely been an ongoing issue. I think the challenge is now, when you look at the size of the organisations that we're talking about versus what they were back then, they really do have. They're going to outlast any government they have, and that's one of their strategies. And I call it efficient evasion. They know that by pushing more committee hearings, by pushing legal challenges, by pushing lobbying, they're just kicking the can down the road as long as they can to maximise their profits. And I look at it very similar to big tobacco. And I think in 5-10 years, when we look back at this for our youth, we wouldn't legislate that kids can buy cigarettes under 18. And I think we're going to have certain areas of our legislation that will change in the near to medium term that will make it and better protect the health of the community.
Yeah, to that point, an interesting point came up that the whole world seems to have adopted the age of 13 as the age in which you can get accounts, because apparently that was something under one act. So you can get a Facebook account, you can get an Instagram account at the age of 13. You could get it at the age of 10 just by lying, as far as I can see. But in your opinion, from a mental health perspective, is 13 necessarily the right age at which you would give people, young people, unfettered access?
It's a good question, Leanne. Have we got any research from an age perspective of?
Yeah, so you'll see in the Reach Out submission that's been made some data around that, and particularly just further to your previous question, also around the needs that parents have for understanding the system in order to support and help their children or their young people accessing. I think age is arbitrary, isn't it? And it is in many different contexts. The issue is the developmental capacity of a young person to understand what's going on and to question and sense check what they're seeing and what they understand. But I think families and guardians and adults, including teachers around that, will help them, and we need to skill them up as well. So, the regulatory framework is obviously one aspect of what you as a committee are examining, but there are other things that we could be doing in terms of getting better understanding and helping parents and adults around young people with their own understanding of technology and their own capacity to question and sense check what they're seeing and what they're hearing.
And I think that was a point that somebody made in one of our hearings, and sorry, I can't be more specific than that. We've had a few hearing days, is that it's actually got to be a combination of things. It's got to be about empowering parents. It's also got to be about educating parents and children. But then there is also that regulatory environment. And I'm hopeful that on one of our hearing days, we'll be having a group called Family Zone, which you might be aware of, Mr. Berryman, who have been actively engaging in this, both in educating parents, but in devising a mechanism that, if they're allowed to access the proper codes of the various companies, that would really empower parents more than the current safety devices, which are on the devices and in the systems. And Mr. Berryman, with your experience in big tech, just to that point, do big tech tend to favour their own developers?
Yeah, definitely. I think we found that out the hard way with Google, and they turned us off with no cause. Because we were sitting on top of their ecosystem, and Facebook did the same. So I think they definitely have self-favoritism. We've seen that in a lot of different instances, especially around the advertising technology, around preferential treatment and so forth. So again, I think it's more philosophically, trust is a massive, especially with what we're talking about, trust is so important. And I think we can't trust them to protect our community and protect the youth especially, and the vulnerable in our community, and therefore it feels like we need to step into that role.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because some would say, well, I think in Twitter's submission, they said trust is at an all-time low for social media, but also for governments. So I think for politicians. So I think they were just having a dig at the committee as much as to say you're just as bad as we are. I didn't actually ask them on that, so I'll try not to put words in their mouth. But in terms of that trust, their response to that is, well, our reputation depends on it. Our reputation depends on people having a good experience and wanting to come back, and we care about people. What would be your response to that allegation? And there's somebody on the roof of my office, so I'm sorry to hear things.
I understand what they're trying to say, but I think they've gone past just being a social media company. They're actually infrastructure now, and it's core to everyone's lives. And like, whether you're an organisation, whether you're whether you're a member of parliament, you can't not have a social media presence. And some people don't. It's a very small minority, but it is actually now infrastructure. It's like saying, oh, you can't have electricity in your house, like for organisations. So I think that their view on that they're not core to the fabric of the world that we live in is quite, helpful for their story and narrative. But I think the reality is, like we saw when Facebook decided to take the nuclear option and turning off Australia, the damage that did to small businesses, the damage that did to communication, the damage that did to people running, their own personal lives. And I think that is what they're using as a scare tactic for what they can do, but it shows also the power they've got, right? So I think, the view of the trust, that ultimately they've kind of gone a level above that, where they're a necessity.
That's actually a really good point, Mr. Berryman. So in fact, in effect, they've created something and we've adapted and we've adopted it to such a degree, and now become so dependent on it to such a degree that they've escalated themselves out of a self-regulatory, out of a just normal corporate business arena into the next level.
Definitely. And I think if you look at any other industry, what other industries do you rely so much on that you can't, basically a lot of people can't live without, right? And that's why I say it's an infrastructure business now. It's not a technology, nice to have social media, let's have a bit of fun and watch some YouTube videos. It's Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and these organisations and Google, all these organisations, they're fundamentally core to your life. And if they are turned off, they will have massive detrimental impact to many people in their different respective areas of their personal or professional life.
Yeah, so you're equating it to sort of our power industry or our standard telecommunications, and all of them have their own regulatory environment.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, that's really powerful. Do you think that this is from a mental health point of view, do you think that there's been enough research as yet? I do think we've had to kick the can down the road on the mental health front, you know, to say we need to do more research. Yes, we definitely need to do more research into the impact and how to make sure that people have got the mechanisms and resilience to deal with whatever they might come across on social media, as well as tempering that. But it has been over a decade of having social media. We must have some definitive research that actually gives us a very good idea as to the impact it's having. Do we have that?
There is some, do you mind me jumping in here? And there is some, obviously some great research underway, remembering that the tech industry is growing and changing itself all the time. So it's not static, and therefore the research has to develop and change to match that, I think, to keep in touch with that. The Origin submission you have provides some important research. For example, you know, that the bullying that might happen between people does happen in a face-to-face context and is exacerbated, if you like, or taken online, but that doesn't remove bullying. It's not where the bullying starts generally. So if you have a look at that, I'd really point you to that research. I get the premise of your question though, which is, you know, don't we already know that it causes harm? And I think that's true. I think it's the detail of that and the balance between what's good and useful and enabling and productive and connective for people. So we know, for example, during the pandemic that online environment was critical to keep some people connected, but it also played into some harms in particular areas. And we know that eating disorders is an area that it really did create some real challenges for people already living with eating disorders or with body image issues and so on.
That's right. So and I think that's a point there that needs to be made too. It's not necessarily the cause, but an exacerbator.
That's right.
And like in the bullying front, I mean, bullying's gone on since, you know, there's always been, you know, children bullying, you know, bullying in playgrounds, but it's the magnifying effect of when it goes into social media and or, you know, then stays there. It's not just said and disappeared. There's always been in defamation a difference between slander and libel.
And Ms. Hammond, I also think that I take the point that's been raised around doing no harm. I guess we'd also want to say there's also doing no further harm. So that in terms of individuals who may feel harmed or anxious or troubled by something, ought to have quick responses from the technology providers, and you know, so that there are quick responses. And I think that you'll probably have found in your evidence that that's not always the case, that there's not always quick responses, and that then creates further harm. And we'd be really underlying that as an important part of the planning and thinking around the regulation. They need to be able to act much more quickly than they do.
Yeah, and I think the current approach would be you don't take something down immediately, you assess it. Whereas a do no further harm, there might actually be a level of things which are take it down. You know, this is that balance between freedom of speech and doing harm. Take it down while it's assessed. You know, based on do no harm, let's go from an assumption that it will cause harm if it stays there even for 10 or 12, because 10 hours can be a shirtload of time in somebody's life.
Right.
Yeah. All right, I might end my questions there. Thank you both very, very much. I know that the chair will have more.
Oh, no, I'm going to hand to Mr. Watts in a moment. And Ms. Hammond, can I thank you very much for that? And I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. I keep coming back to that comment about over-moderation, which I think is the way you've referred, the way you've nicely encapsulated that is around do no further harm. So what can be done, what action can be done to ensure that if harm has taken place, that there is no further harm, is a very good way of framing some of our considerations. I also want to come back to a comment that Ms. Hammond made, actually, and just endorse the thinking behind it. And Celia, Ms. Hammond, sorry, if I reframe this incorrectly, I apologise. But the comment around how platforms should not be the ones setting the community standards, but but that, I guess, just taking what she said there, which I completely 100% endorse, I'm then thinking through when platforms do not align with our community standards, our expected community standards, they're actually influencing them. So they're playing a role, I guess, in that sense, which when you then link that with some of your comments around this being infrastructure, I just think is incredibly powerful and certainly a very interesting way for the committee to be able to frame some of its considerations. So I guess just more of a comment to say thank you for giving us a frame of reference and a bit of a lens. If you'd like to provide further comment on that, please feel free to do so. If you prefer it to sort of stand as a comment, I'm happy to cede to the Deputy Chair.
Thank you. No, we're happy to take that on notice, and we might come back with something a little bit extending on that.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. And look, certainly from when you were talking about whether it be electricity or if it's a new tunnel being built, to provide easier access in terms of infrastructure, or even roads, if you think about the safety requirements that are built in around there. It is a very interesting concept when you consider social media and platforms to be infrastructure as to the approach that you then take. So yeah, any further observations would certainly be appreciated, and accept that on notice. Deputy Chair?
No, I don't have anything further to add, Chair.
Can I thank you very much in that case for your time? Are there any further questions from anyone else on the committee I should check? That being the case, I'd very much like to thank you both for your time and your attendance here today. Thank you for your submission that you've made, the opening statement that you also made and provided to the committee, and just ask that if you have been asked to provide additional information to please forward it through to the Secretariat by the 4th of February 2022. I'd also like to indicate that you will be sent a copy of the transcript with your evidence, a copy of the transcript with your evidence, and you will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you for your
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for
having us.
Thank you. The committee will suspend for maybe just 2 or 3 minutes to enable our next witnesses from Centre for Digital Wellbeing to attend. All right, I'll now resume the public hearing of the Select Committee on Social Media and Online Safety via video and teleconference, and welcome welcome representatives of the Centre for Digital Wellbeing to give evidence today. And I ask that for the Hansard record for you to please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee.
Carla Welsh here, and my capacity is Chair of the Centre for Digital Wellbeing.
And Veronica Finn, Manager of the Centre for Digital Wellbeing.
Thank you very much. Just some formalities to commence. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'd like to thank you to commence. I'd like to thank you for your very thoughtful submission that you did make in advance of this hearing to the committee. That submission has been published. Would you like to make any further comments or further statements before we commence discussion and questions from the committee?
That would be appreciated.
Sorry, I just missed the first part of that.
That would be appreciated.
Thank you. Please proceed.
I thank the Chair and the committee members for allowing us to appear today. Before proceeding, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, past, present and future, acknowledge that I'm coming from Ngunnawal land today. The topic that we're addressing is emerging as one of the greatest social policy is the start of a structural change and the creation of a new category in seeking to influence economic behaviour. Such are fundamentally altering human behaviour and transforming social relations. This is different to others because the business model of social media platforms requires that they target and mitigate our social characteristics. Other tech innovations may have moved us about faster or performed calculations for us. Social media platforms work to extract profit from human networks, human connections, and personal life. We are hardwired to be social, to crave validation and belonging. These needs are the requirements that social media seeks to replace and manipulate as part of an emerging business. The harms of this model are produced both through the outcomes they use to drive engagement and derive profits, and through their design, such as filter shares, likes, and infinite scrolling. Platforms engage us through hyper-stimulating us and artificially produce validation. They feed belonging through generating collective outrage, and they cultivate and manipulate identity through algorithmically curated content. The impact of such platforms exists at both the individual level and the aggregate societal level. It is important to continue on. The focus of race has been around behavioural events, harassment, they enable abuse. But for a generation, the risks include addiction, depression, and these impacts also appear to be gendered, with young women most at risk. At a societal level, we are only beginning to understand the full influence of mass algorithmic engagement, but it is clear media is increasing polarisation and division. Such platforms are also the perfect conduit for the spread of information and disinformation. The potential societal impacts are perhaps the most profound, and yet to date, much of the regulatory approach is focused on individual harms. The work of this committee is pressing and critical. In looking at the global regulatory landscape, three of the most important dilemmas of the social media era remain unsolved. And they are, what is the appropriate degree of platform power, and how do we address the inherent between users and platforms? How do we avoid misinformation, disinformation, and polarization? And how do we protect data and digital identity? Indeed, many of the questions we are grappling with are around data rights. Who owns data? How is data used? How are users made aware of the usage of this data? These are fundamental questions, and the answers are urgent. We are also only at part one, the starting point. We are hurtling towards the next phase of digitalisation, including the adoption of AI and the application of Web3 or Web 3.0 technologies such as blockchain and the convergence of social media and gaming. And they appear to be a precursor to an emerging metaverse, or at the very least, the next phase of the internet. As we speak, many of the companies that presented over the last 2 days are scrambling for a central place in Web3. Facebook has renamed itself as Meta. Predicting the exact future technology is near impossible, but envisaging the conceptual trajectory is easier. Without having a crystal ball, members of the committee will need to consider a regulatory approach that is fit for purpose, not only for the platforms of today or tomorrow. We need regulatory frameworks that look around the corner. While the next phase of the internet remains only an outline, what is clear towards an economy, towards value from data, towards monetarization of social relations will be persistent. A regulatory framework needs to mitigate asymmetries of power between users and platforms, combat misinformation, disinformation, and polarization, and protect data so that individuals have control and understanding about how their data is used. The speed of the adoption of the internet is unparalleled. We live in the exponential age, where our digital engagement is accelerating faster and faster. Regulation needs to be systemic, comprehensive, and profound. And in understanding the impacts of social media, we need to see regulation as only one part of the solution. There is so much to do in social cohesion, building meaningful relationships and real-world connection, trust in institutions, and a sense of community. Thank you, and I welcome the opportunity to answer questions.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I'll just flag that some of us, at least me, it may not be the case for everyone, some of the sound, I was not able to capture every word that you were saying. I'll just ask that if you're okay, that you provide a copy of what you have just said there to the Secretariat so that we can ensure the transcription is accurate, and on reflection have a look over that. And I'm not sure if there might be something that can be done at your end in relation to the microphone or something. Yeah, thank you. One of the challenges of working this way. I do appreciate your opening statement and also a number of the important matters that you raised there. The Deputy Chair has indicated that he's happy to start the line of questions and discussion, so I might hand over to the Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, witnesses, for appearing today and for your thoughtful submission. If I could just take you to the submission, you recommend that, quote, the government increase transparency and accountability of algorithms by mandating social media companies publish key features of their algorithms. Can you please explain to the committee what the key features you would be looking for in such a transparency regime, and why you see this as a necessary regulatory intervention?
Yes, partially answered. Particularly for a social policy body rather than a technology company, and so to some extent, I think need to be determined with people with far more expertise. Can everyone hear me? By the way, is there, with my headphones on?
I can hear. Yes.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I think that's one part of it. I think in general, what we probably need to do, and we included a paper on international regulatory approaches, is borrow collectively from some of the emerging themes. I think the UK has done in particular the impact or the capacity to be able to look at regulation with respect to personal harms. I think that to some extent the EU has done a lot in terms of deep profiling and the capacity to be able to look at deep profiling. And I think some of the US legislation, particularly around transparency of algorithms, is worth looking at in sort of conceiving broader regulatory.
Okay, thank you. So further in your submission, you recommend that the government, quote, consider regulating a duty of care to users as part of a licensing scheme for social media providers to operate a digital space. So I understand this will go a little bit further than the UK's draft Online Safety Bill and the EU's proposed Digital Services Act. So what are the benefits of this approach as you see them, and why is this something you recommend that we be exploring in Australia?
Yeah, so I think duty of care becomes really important in terms of setting up a broader onus and a regulatory onus on social platforms to perceive that the service that they are in instances providing is social square, and that the management of social square becomes fundamental to broader concepts of social cohesion and the capacity to be able to engender trust in institutions and the maintenance of democracy. So it's not in some senses a narrow scope. In an increasingly digitalised world, and looking at the amount of time spent in digitalisation in the digital world, there is a significant onus to shift a lot of the regulatory framework we have in general society into a digital space. And I apologise, there's a lot of background noise in my sound.
Sorry, I can hear you and understand you well.
Okay.
So
Lovely.
another.
There are all sorts of clunking, so I'm not sure what's.
I think there might be a little bit of feedback, but I can hear you clearly. If I can hear you, the Hansard will hear you. That's okay. So another issue that you flag in your submission is around the need for increased education and guidance for online safety and digital literacy. So you're aware of what the government's currently delivering in this space and where that isn't hitting the mark and what more needs to be done on this digital literacy front?
Yeah, look, I think we're probably really at the start of it. And I think it's interesting because even talking to some of our counterparts and advisory board members that are in the US or say the UK, I think there's possibly a much broader social conversation that's happening in the US around social media than. And I think in particular comparing and the notion of really in a way impact of the use of platforms on youth mental health, infancy. And I think to some extent, working through schools, working through education frameworks, but also seeing an increasing parent education is probably part of the key to it. I think the other key is trying to work out what are some of the frameworks that we use to describe relationship with technology. One of the committee members, one of the members we have for Digital Wellbeing is John Brewer, who has the concept of digital nutrition, which is that you want a relationship with social media platforms, much like you do the food pyramid, which is to say that you can have a relationship with it, but you also have to understand that overusage has effects, and those effects can be detrimental. And so learning how to have a relationship with technology that all consuming, where you are still, particularly in the developmental process of youth, learning and experiencing ways of communicating that aren't just digitally facilitated.
So it's a particular need with young people then?
I think youth is a particular need. I think there's so much space in general in terms of the harms. And I think one of the things that we put in the opening statement is to break down into what are some of the impacts and effects on individuals, and then what are some of the broader social impacts. And I think the impacts on individuals really fall hardest in terms of youth, and in particular in terms of that phase of development around empathy and human relationships. The societal impact, a lot of things are really around polarization, misinformation and disinformation, and the potential impacts of social media in creating new forms of or new fault lines with cohesion, such as anti-institutionalism, which is starting to emerge. And so to some extent, one of the difficulties in regulating this space is you're regulating very different kinds of effects. Some individuals, some really at the aggregate level.
Yeah, this is something that a number of witnesses have raised, and that the current regulatory regime is fairly focused on individualised harms, and that the Online Safety Act, for example, doesn't encompass broader harms. So, harmful content to people's group identities, for example, or to social cohesion, or the health of our democracy. So you'd be arguing that we need regulatory interventions that are designed to attack those broader harms rather than just the individualised harm.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to look at sort of where are the key points in different regulatory frameworks. Focusing very much on sort of deep profiling and data privacy. And I think it's a good starting really goes to the engine room of social media. I think this is focused in particular because some of the issues in the US have really risen around such an increased level of polarization. And in particular, obviously, the events previously in terms of the Capitol riots have really kind of focused the US regulatory agenda around transparency of algorithms. And in some senses, I think that is a nod to that broader issue around aggregate level harms. And then I think the UK is sort of in that balance with a care style model really to look and focus from what we can on that balance between individual based identity. And so to some extent, all of them have validity because each of them use that with and continue to face it not in a more creative way.
Just one more question on that point, and then I'll hand the mic back to the chair. You call in your submission for the establishment of an Office of Disinformation to monitor the spread of disinformation, inform the public of disinformation strategies, and to bring to light campaigns designed to erode trust in public institutions, destabilise social cohesion, and distort public opinion. One of the proposals we've heard from is the establishment of transparency mechanisms to give transparency to widely shared content on platforms, so you can see what is sort of going viral in a real-time basis, so to speak. The use of live lists in election periods or during public health crises, things like that, see if we can identify this early. From the sounds of that, of your submission, that's the kind of transparency you'd be looking for to tackle that disinformation problem?
Yes, absolutely. An Office of Disinformation sounds like an all-in concept, but at the same time, that really would be the focus of it, which would be to be able to try and get ahead of the curve, and to some of these issues, one of the remedies is to bring it to light, and to bring it to light early, and the nature of social media platforms. And some of it's the features, and this was another point I made in the opening statement, which is that to some extent, some of the issues around algorithms, but some are also design features. It's within social media platforms, I call attention to, say, as an example, Facebook, the capacity to be able to then on-share a piece of information, and then for them to on piece of information and so forth, means that the spread of information is so fast and so viral. And so to some extent, the only combat is to be able to sort of track it, bring it to light, and address it as quickly as possible. And so I think we are probably at the point of mechanisms and coordination functions.
Thank you. That's my last question. I'm happy to hand over now, Chair.
Thank you very, very much for that. I believe there are some questions from Ms. Hammond, and thank you very much for your evidence. We do appreciate that. Ms. Hammond?
Yes, thank you very much for your evidence and for your written submission. If you're hearing noise, there is somebody on my roof. I think they're clearing gutters, so I'll mute in between my speaking. I really valued reading your submission and your evidence this morning as well. And I think I've picked up a number of things, that the three key issues that we have to grapple with, the relative power of platforms, disinformation, misinformation, polarisation, and protecting identity. And you've also identified that we need to look at the impact on individuals and a societal impact. Do you, and you may or may not want to comment on this, do you think that the big social media platforms and companies accept that what has been created is actually, I guess, bigger than what might have first been anticipated, and that they accept that it needs to be looked at with those lenses?
I'm not sure if public comment would have to, that would end. To some extent, it is such a structural change in the nature of the economy. And Shoshana Zuboff in Surveillance Capitalism does a really good job of articulating why it's such a fundamental change. Then it would be very difficult. I mean, we're talking about, in a sense, companies that are the biggest companies are by and large now social media platforms or similar, or involved in the creation of, Amazon Web Services, etc. I'd put them sort of at the fringe, but very much in the creation of the new and emerging forms of the internet and the social side, or Web 2.0. That's economy that's occurring, and when that level of structural change is occurring, the impact in terms of social change almost by definition has to be there. But in this particular case, because of the nature of the way in which economic change is occurring, because it is specifically targeting the aspects of characteristics of humans as part of the social change to it. It would have been hard to have imagined it, I think, in the beginning.
I'm old enough to remember a workplace before technology, and I actually remember when emails started to be used. And sometime in the 2010s, I remember getting concerned, no evidence based to it, just anecdotal and experiential, that email as a form of communication was replacing, in many cases, face-to-face communication, and that the level of misunderstandings and or disagreements and or people disputes appeared to me to be increasing, because when you have face-to-face communication, you've got all that additional nuance of body language and immediately seeing somebody's response that, you can see in their eyes, well, that shocked them or something like that, so that you can pick up those cues. But I was concerned, and as I say, anecdotal, experiential, that relying on written instantaneous where you don't reflect and you hit send was contributing to an increasing fracturing. Is there any basis? Is there any research being done on this that talks about that distinction? Because it's on social media as well, the distinction between face-to-face engaged communication versus online or email communication, and is that a societal impact that we have to be looking at now too?
Yeah. An excellent question, and I'm going to answer it to the best of my knowledge, and I'm sure there's a lot out there that I haven't had an opportunity yet to read. One of them is that one of the really interesting experiments that was done most recently, and I can look it up and try it and forward it through to the committee, but it was looking at whether or not when you take away the devices, you can increase the empathy of a class group on people. And so one of the projects was to look at, they asked a series of questions that were really designed to elicit the level of empathy of a group while they were in an environment where they were using technology, in particular social media platforms. Then that technology was removed for 2 weeks. They went into, or 1 or 2 weeks, I can't remember the details, but they went into a camp, zero access to technology, and everything was face to face. And then they made a level of empathy at the end of it.
Lots of withdrawal, I imagine, in that 2-week period.
By a realization that face-to-face can be fun. And the end result was a significant increase in empathy levels. And so I think that goes to your point around know, does digitally mediated social engagement reduce the level of empathy and increase the level of tensions inherently by taking away? That is yes. I think then when you combine that with what do people react to on social media, what do they engage with, and the content that they engage with, you know, it turns out, unfortunately, is the bit angry or upset or fearful. Yes, and also other positive emotions, but certainly the bits that really press our buttons can be the really sort of negative emotions and reactions, and the capacity to be able to share that and form a sense of outrage, I think has also aggregate increased the level of social discord, and that is the driver in some senses of polarisation.
Yeah, I often wonder whether, is there an element that when you're making comments on posts or doing things like that, you know, people who make them, in many cases, they're not awful people, and they wouldn't say it to your face, but they'll put it in writing. Is there an element of that, I guess, it not being face-to-face and it being, is there an element of it, you forget that there's a person who might be receiving that comment or who might be reading that?
Absolutely, and I think there's also some other evidence to suggest our assessments of the level of harm caused from written or online feedback, so negative comments, is that we perceive it as being far less harmful, and yet the impact of receiving a negative comment on Facebook, on Twitter, or base behaviour or bullying is as though it happened to us. We react in the same way with that sense of, you know, rejection, the sense that we've kind of lost face within the group. So to some extent, when you have a reduced notion that you're causing harm, and yet the harm is still very much being felt as harm, I think, you know, that in its sense lends itself to significant levels of kind of aggregate harm.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Okay, moving on entirely different. I could talk about that for quite some time, but one of the recommendations that you've made is to consider regulating a duty of care to users as part of a licensing scheme for social media providers to operate at digital space. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, and I think we probably need to do more work on it before we go there, but regulation. But as I think is critical in the sense of perceiving, because at the moment we're looking at it as social media platforms, but where it seems to be evolving to, and games such as Fortnite are a really good example of this. So it's obviously an online gaming environment, but in reality, it's facilitating, it's the earliest kind of notions of parts of the metaverse as it's described. Gaming and social media are kind of combining in online digitals.
Yeah.
And for they are as real as being in the playground or as real as hanging out in a physical setting.
Yep.
You know, they are, anyone who's got teenagers will tell you that when they get home from school and drop their school bag, they want to hang out online and chat and talk. It's not necessarily even about participating in the game. It is a form of social interaction and engagement. And so understanding that we need to regulate that space from a social standpoint, but also that we need to then look at what are the parameters around those sorts of technologies. And this becomes really key because it's not just about, a lot of social media is really the determination of deep profiling and data points to be able to human behaviour. But where we're also influencing human behaviour, and when we start to influence human behaviour in ways digital, then there is a duty of care, because the online spaces for the generation that are coming through are just as real as the spaces that are in the real world.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that was a very long answer.
No, it wasn't. I mean, I'm yeah, aware of that. And in some way, do you think that for digital natives and for the online world, for that generation, that they have been tooled or equipped better than those of us who are not naturals in it or natives to it?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the big myths as well. We assume that, so there's a whole lot of myths. We assume that tech is inevitable. We assume that if our kids are using technology, they're learning all the skill sets of a new world. And yet I think it comes down to the point that you made at the beginning, which is that human empathy and the capacity to connect and are really important skill sets. Not how fast you type or how fast you tweet or how fast you can engage in the digital world. And those lost skill sets, I think, are cause for significant concern.
Yeah, and that desire for human interaction. I do recall at the start of the pandemic, some children I know may have been really happy that when they first went to school, teaching online, school online, that they didn't have to get up, put the uniform on and go to school. But after, I think it was only about 3 days, they wanted to get back to school to see mates and hang out and that sort of stuff. So it's that element of being with others.
Absolutely. And I think the other point about COVID is it has very much normalised the digital world in a way. It's accelerated that process and possibly kind of shortcutted it a decade. You know, in the process of it is probably more to tip the balance in terms of digitalisation than any other action or that any new platform or any new technology could.
Yeah, you're not going to start with a conspiracy theory, are you?
No.
I'm sure I've had that sent to me. But you're right, particularly, I would say also particularly in the economic side of things, because there are all sorts of people who, certainly at the start of the pandemic, who wouldn't have done any online shopping, who wouldn't have done any online engagement of things, you know, engaging with public services or with Centrelink or whatever, who suddenly had to transition to that. And so it's escalated. They had to. And so now there is more of that level of engagement. Look, I really appreciate your submission. I read it while I was reading submissions from others, and the contrast in the level of, I guess, a consideration of whether things are an issue or they aren't an issue, or whether regulation is needed or whether actions are needed, was really quite stark to me. That there were some submissions that are effectively saying, oh, you know, same old, nothing new here. And then yours provided a much different, a very different perspective, which was really valuable. So thank you very much. And I will hand back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hammond. I'm conscious that we a number of this we've gone over already. It's now just after 1:35. I'm just wondering, with the indulgence of the witnesses and other members of the committee, if we could go on to 1:45. I do need to leave at that time, unfortunately, but I'm conscious that Mr. Kelly has some additional questions. I'm going to put my additional questions on notice, and I believe the Deputy Chair will do the same. Mr. Kelly, do you have further questions?
Yes, please. I'll try and be as brief as I possibly can. You talked about an office of misinformation. How do we stop such an office of misinformation turning into a Ministry of Truth, something like we see in 1984?
Okay. But I'll just correct it, not so much an office of misinformation, but disinformation.
Okay, and how do you see that working?
Probably one of the more primary concerns. Yeah, so look, I think probably one of the primary concerns would be to work broader context, but the degree to which foreign interference within social media structures, there is significant amount of potential, and I think, you know, that would be an ongoing level of concern in terms of the institutions. And I think one of the points I would make here is that in broadening the scope, we need to really not just focus on English language-based forms, but also looking at platforms such as WeChat and some of the platforms that are based within the Chinese internet structures. And I think information in a broad sense of actively undermining trust in institutions.
Right. So how do you? Where's the point on social media? One of the concerns that I have, and I wanted to comment on this, is what is often described as misinformation is simply an alternate opinion, and in many cases, alternate expert opinion that may disagree from the government's point of view at a particular period of time. And describing it as misinformation and shutting it down is an affront to free speech, stifles debate, and actually sends us backwards as a society, an open and free society, where we allow dissenting opinions.
Yes. So in terms of the recommendation we're making, if there's a strong distinction, and I'd start with this, between misinformation and information, and I appreciate the point that you're making, but if misinformation is false information that spreads, I think what we would be concerned about is disinformation, which is a malicious intent to spread information that is knowingly false, which often to issues around foreign interference.
Sorry to interrupt. I know we're short of time, but who makes the determination of what is misinformation?
Yeah, so I think if you're asking me about our recommendation, because our recommendation specifically around disinformation, not misinformation.
Okay, there's a subtle difference, I think, in the public's mind. Is my concern, my great concern. Again, maybe I might express a comment on this, is that what is being described as misinformation by these social media giants, in many circumstances, is not misinformation at all, but it is a legitimate alternate opinion, and the social media giants are using their platforms to spread misinformation by calling alternate opinions in themselves misinformation.
Information does have a different definition to misinformation, and part, I think, in looking at the spread of disinformation, you're looking at information that is often maliciously spread, often by foreign actors, is part of the connection there, and often through the things like troll farms and trolls, which become really obvious investigation. So we are talking about a different phenomenon to the phenomenon of misinformation. I think probably one is that to some extent, one of the foundation degree of independent journalism, and information on social media is very different to the kind of reporting that is by journalists and by the Fourth Estate. and having really strong media institutions and a diversity of media institutions is actually, the erosion of that is significant in terms of its democracy and institutions.
Okay, thank you. The line's just a bit difficult and breaking up, so I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. And I do want to thank our witnesses for your time and your attendance today. We do appreciate the substantive discussion that we've had, and we thank you for your very thoughtful response. I thank you also for the submission that you made and, of course, for your attendance and the time that you've given us today. And I ask that if you are asked to provide additional information or to responses to questions on notice, and I do have some as well, please if you could forward those through to the Secretariat by the 4th of February 2022. I'll advise that you will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence with an opportunity and given an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Again, can I thank committee members for their attendance, the Secretariat for their assistance and all witnesses today. I now declare this public hearing closed and the committee is adjourned until next Thursday, the 27th of January.